This is it, the ultimate dimension for rest and stories, and it's called Sleepy Myths.
Welcome back, dreamers, to Sleepy Myths. If you enjoy these soft, thoughtful stories to drift away to, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. It helps us keep the lights low, the coffee warm, and the dreams endless. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you listening from and what time is it there? Maybe it's past midnight, maybe it's early morning. Wherever you are, take a deep breath. Let the day fall away and grab your coffee. Let's begin. It began with a sound that wasn't quite thunder and wasn't quite music either, with a hum that glowed. It moved through the quiet corners of the Smith household like a gentle pulse, brushing the windows, touching the picture frames, stirring the dust on the old shelves. Morty opened his eyes to that sound. It was familiar in a strange way, like something he'd dreamt about but forgotten. The room was dark except for the faint green shimmer leaking through the curtains. Outside, the night sky wasn't still. It shimmered, bending and folding as if someone were quietly turning the stars like gears. And there, standing barefoot in the wet grass, was Rick. His portal gun dangled in his hand, flickering with tired light. Each pulse made the air breathe in colors no human word could name. Pale blues that felt like calm, soft pinks that felt like sadness, and the occasional streak of gold that reminded Morty of laughter he hadn't heard in years. He didn't call out. Rick looked different tonight, smaller, gentler, almost careful. The portal shimmered in front of him, like a mirror made of light and memory. Through it, figures emerged. Not monsters, not creatures, but children. Small, weightless shapes made of light and breath, their skin tinted in quiet shades. Lavender, cyan, silver, rose. They didn't walk so much as drift, their feet never touching the ground. Their eyes were enormous, filled not with fear but with wonder, as if they were seeing the universe for the first time. Rick didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't gloat. He just watched. Then softly he said, "All right." Just for one night, Morty stepped outside. The air was cool and smelled faintly of ozone. He wrapped his blanket around his shoulders and watched as Rick guided the alien children toward the porch. One of them reached out, touching the railing, and the old wood bloomed. Tiny flowers sprouted where the small glowing fingers had rested, white and blue, trembling softly in the breeze. "Rick," Morty whispered. "What are they?" Rick shrugged. "Strays." His voice was quiet, like he didn't want to disturb the air. They fell through a crack between dimensions. Should have gone somewhere else, but they ended up here. The smallest of the children turned its head toward Morty. It didn't have a mouth, but it smiled somehow, not with lips, but with light. Morty felt his chest warm. Rick rubbed the back of his neck. "They'll stay until morning. Then I'll send them home." But even as he said it, there was hesitation, the kind of hesitation that grows in a person who's seen too much leaving, too many goodbyes. He crouched beside the glowing figures, adjusting a small device on his wrist. The portal flickered once and dimmed, sealing shut behind them. The house for once didn't feel like a house. It felt like a place holding its breath. The children wandered through the living room, touching the curtains, the lamps, the old photographs on the mantel. Where their hands lingered, light rippled, soft trails of phosphorescent mist dissolving like sighs. Morty followed one of them to the kitchen. It brushed its hand along the coffee maker, and the faint hum that filled the air seemed to sync with the quiet ticking of the clock. For a moment, time didn't feel linear. It felt circular, rhythmic, like a heartbeat the whole room shared. Rick was at the table, disassembling the portal gun. The glow from the alien children made his face look older, the lines deeper, but his eyes softer. "They're harmless," he muttered. "Probably running on some kind of empathic energy field. It's fine," but his tone wasn't scientific. It was careful, almost tender. One of the children floated closer to him, tilting its head. Its light dimmed and brightened with each breath Rick took. Slowly he reached out and set his hand on its shoulder, if you could call it that. The air shimmered under his touch. Morty saw it clearly. The tiny tremor in Rick's hand, the kind that happens when someone feels something they haven't felt in a long time. Hours passed without anyone speaking. The children settled in the corners of the room, their bodies dimming until they looked almost human in the half-light. Rick sat in his chair, staring at them, muttering to himself about stability fields and vibrational tone mapping, but every few seconds he'd stop, just to listen, because the humming hadn't stopped. It was faint now, a lullaby woven through the walls. Morty lay on the couch, wrapped in his blanket, eyes half closed. The hum wasn't just sound, it was feeling. It carried something he couldn't describe, a memory of being loved, of being small and safe, of someone watching over him as he drifted to sleep. Outside, the sky had changed color. The stars weren't still anymore. They pulsed softly to the same rhythm as the children's hum, a universe breathing along with a single house on a quiet street. Rick leaned back, arms crossed, eyelids heavy. For a fleeting second he looked peaceful, like the man he might have been before the years wore him thin. "Just one night," he murmured again, but Morty heard the weight behind it, the quiet knowing that some nights change everything. He closed his eyes, and the hum carried him into dreams, dreams of glowing skies, soft voices, and the sound of stars remembering how to sing. The morning light crept gently across the Smith household, as if afraid to wake whatever slept inside. It glowed pale and kind, sliding across the windowsill, catching dust in slow motion. For once, everything was still. No blaring TV. No arguments. No sound except for the faint hum that lingered in the air. Morty sat at the edge of his bed, half awake, half lost in the memory of the night before. It hadn't been a dream. The light outside the curtains proved that. When he peeked into the hallway, soft glimmers drifted across the walls like reflections on water. The alien children were still there. They didn't speak. They never did. Instead, they hummed. It wasn't the same kind of hum as last night. This one was softer, rounder, almost like the tone you hear right before you fall asleep. The house felt alive with it. The curtains swayed without wind. The floorboards vibrated ever so slightly under Morty's bare feet, like a heartbeat pulsing through the walls. Downstairs, Rick was already in the kitchen. The smell of coffee mingled strangely with ozone and starlight, that faint scent that follows something unearthly. He stood at the counter, not looking at the children clustered nearby. His goggles rested on his forehead, and a cigarette he wasn't actually smoking dangled from his lips. "Morning, Morty," he muttered. "Or whatever this is." Morty rubbed his eyes. "They're still here." "Yup, guess they didn't feel like leaving." Rick didn't sound surprised. His voice was low, almost careful, like he didn't want to scare the air itself. "They don't talk. Not in any language we can measure. But they're humming." He paused, tapping a small recorder on the table. "It's affecting the house's electrical systems, stabilizing energy, reversing entropy in small spaces. I don't know if that's terrifying or beautiful." Morty blinked. "What's entropy again?" Rick waved his hand. "The universe's way of telling us everything falls apart eventually. Except apparently, when they sing." The smallest child, a glowing figure the color of moonlight on water, drifted closer to the kitchen window. It placed its hand against the glass. Outside, the grass began to shimmer, and before Morty's eyes it grew. Small buds unfurled into flowers in seconds. Dewdrops caught the sunlight, scattering tiny rainbows across the yard. Morty gasped softly. "Did you see that?" Rick didn't answer right away. He was watching too, not analyzing, not calculating, just watching. Then he blinked hard and turned away, pretending to focus on his coffee. "It's a biological resonance," he muttered under his breath. "Their sound waves must be syncing with the planet's base frequencies. Doesn't mean anything, but—" Morty saw his expression, that fragile crease around. His eyes when something actually moved him. The children wandered through the house like fragments of a dream that refused to end. They never knocked things over, never spoke, never touched anything for too long. But wherever they passed, the world responded. The old photo frames stopped tilting. The clock in the living room, which had been broken for years, began to tick again. In the corner, the small potted plant Beth had forgotten to water for weeks lifted its leaves. Green and alive, Rick kept pretending not to care. He mumbled formulas into his recorder, muttered data points and scribbled graphs on napkins. But every so often, Morty would catch him looking, really looking, at the children. There was something fragile in that gaze. A memory, maybe, something he couldn't name. Later that afternoon, Rick retreated to his garage. Morty followed quietly, peeking from behind the doorway. The lab had changed. The cold metal and harsh fluorescent lights seemed softer now, bathed in a faint glow that wasn't entirely electric. The alien children had followed too. They hovered silently near the ceiling, their hum blending into the sound of Rick's machinery. Rick grumbled to himself. I'm not a babysitter. I'm a scientist. This is an observation, data collection, emotional anomalies in resonance frequencies. That's all, but the way he spoke betrayed him. His voice cracked just slightly on emotional. Morty stepped closer. Rick, do they know what they're doing? Like, do they know they're changing stuff? Rick sighed and rubbed his temples. I don't know, Morty. Maybe they're just... He paused, watching one of the beings drift toward his desk. Maybe they're just doing what they are. Like how the sun shines or how you stutter when you're nervous, Morty frowned. I don't stutter. Rick looked over his shoulder with a half smile. You just did. The hum deepened, richer now, filling the garage like invisible fog. It seemed to vibrate inside Morty's chest. For a moment he felt something strange. Calm. His heartbeat slowed. His thoughts, usually tangled and racing, softened into a kind of peace he hadn't known he needed. Rick noticed. You feel it too, huh? Morty nodded. It's like they're singing to everything. Rick tilted his head. No, Morty, not to everything. With everything. That night the house glowed faintly from the outside. Neighbors might have thought it was a reflection, a trick of the moonlight. But inside, the air shimmered with something unmeasurable. Not science, not magic, but empathy in its purest form. The alien children gathered in the living room, forming a small circle. Morty sat nearby, hugging his knees, watching the light play across their faces. They began to hum again, low and rhythmic. The entire house seemed to breathe along with them. Rick stayed in the doorway, arms crossed. His usual sarcasm didn't come. Instead, he looked almost fragile, a man who'd spent his life dissecting the universe, only to find that the answers he sought were shaped like lullabies. Why do they hum like that? Morty whispered. Rick exhaled, slow and uncertain. Because words mess things up. Maybe they figured that out before we did. For the first time, Morty saw Rick not as a genius, not as a broken old man, but as someone standing in the middle of something too beautiful to quantify and terrified of ruining it. The hum deepened again, pulsing through every wall, every beam, every heartbeat. The lamps flickered not from power surges, but from rhythm. Even the air seemed to glow faintly gold. Morty closed his eyes. He could feel the warmth from the beings, not on his skin, but inside him. It wasn't heat. It was memory. He didn't know of what, only that it felt like home. Rick whispered almost to himself, Careful, Morty, that feeling. That's how universes start. Morty smiled sleepily. Then maybe it's about time one started here. The children's hum grew softer, slower, fading into the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full. The silence before dreams. The silence that promises something beautiful is still unfolding. Outside, the stars blinked like they were listening. The garage used to sound like chaos. Buzzing wires, glass clinking, the impatient rhythm of Rick's muttering, like a mind that could never rest. But now that same room breathed differently. The hum of the alien children had changed everything. Even the machines seemed to pulse more softly, almost in time with a heartbeat the room had long forgotten. Rick didn't say it aloud, but he had transformed his lab. Slowly, almost unconsciously, he had begun replacing the cluttered mess of tools with gentle shapes, domes of translucent glass, soft glowing pods that shimmered like captured dawnlight. The sharp edges of science had been rounded into something that looked and felt like comfort. Morty noticed the change first. When he stepped into the lab one evening, he had to blink twice. The harsh fluorescent lights were gone. In their place, a low violet glow filled the room, as though the stars themselves had agreed to live in the rafters. Beakers and vials were gone, replaced by softly humming containers filled with liquid light. The air was warm, alive. Whoa, Morty whispered, stepping closer to one of the glowing pods. Rick, what is this? It's like your lab turned into a nightlight. Rick didn't look up from his workbench. His coat was off, sleeves rolled to the elbows, his face gentler than Morty had ever seen it. Bioluminal resonance, he said softly. Energy born from empathy. Turns out the more peaceful the environment, the more stable the particles. Huh. Morty tilted his head. So, you made your lab peaceful? Rick smirked faintly. I made it efficient. The peace is just a side effect, but Morty didn't buy it. The way Rick's hands moved and steady, unhurried, told a different story. This wasn't the impatient Rick who drank through every experiment. This was someone listening to the hum of the children, as though they were guiding him through a melody too delicate to interrupt. The alien children stood quietly nearby, their glowing eyes watching every movement. They didn't seem curious in the human sense. They seemed aware, connected. When Rick adjusted a dial, they hummed a note that matched the sound frequency exactly, tuning the room to harmony. It was like watching a duet between logic and feeling. Science and lullaby woven together. Rick gestured toward the pods. Each one stabilizes a different frequency of resonance. Compassion, memory, patience, forgiveness. Turns out those are measurable things if you know how to listen. Morty blinked. Wait, you're measuring emotions? Rick shrugged. Don't make it weird. Everything in the universe vibrates. Emotions are just another form of vibration. These kids, they're basically the tuning forks of the cosmos. Morty walked closer, peering into one of the pods. Inside, strands of light drifted like underwater currents. Every so often they would pulse in color, soft blues when Morty inhaled, warm gold when he exhaled. They're responding to you, Rick murmured, watching. Guess you're calmer than I thought, Morty smiled shyly. Maybe they just like me, Rick chuckled under his breath. Careful, Morty, that's how cults start. But even his sarcasm had softened, carrying no sting. One of the children drifted closer, the smallest one, pale and translucent, like morning mist. It reached out and touched one of the pods. The light inside rippled outward, then multiplied, expanding into gentle waves that illuminated the entire room. Rick looked up. Now that's interesting, Morty frowned. What's happening? Rick leaned forward, watching the waveforms stabilize on his monitor. They're syncing the energy of the pods with the rhythm of their hums. They're making it sing, and it did. The entire lab began to resonate, not with harsh mechanical noise, but with a song so subtle it felt like the air was breathing in harmony with them. It wasn't a melody anyone could hum. It was deeper, older, something like the universe remembering how to cradle itself. Rick stood there, jaw set, eyes soft. He didn't interrupt, didn't analyze, just listened. For once, silence wasn't awkward between them. It was holy. After a while, Morty sat cross-legged on the floor. He didn't want to break the spell. The light from the pods reflected across his face, painting him in pastel shades of pink and blue. He watched Rick, his brilliant, broken grandfather, working slowly, gently, as if building something sacred instead of scientific. You ever think, Morty said quietly, that maybe science is just a different kind of prayer? Rick froze for a moment. His eyes flicked toward Morty, unreadable. That's dangerously poetic, Morty. You feeling okay? Morty smiled faintly. Yeah, I just mean, you spend your whole life trying to understand everything. But maybe sometimes understanding isn't the point. Rick looked down at the pod again, his reflection bending across the glass. You sound like your mum. The words hung there soft but heavy. Outside, the evening sky deepened into indigo. The world beyond the garage windows glowed faintly with the children's resonance. Even the wind seemed to move slower, careful not to disturb the light. Rick sat down beside Morty on the floor. They didn't talk for a while. The hum of the children filled every corner, blending with the faint rhythmic flicker of the pods. Finally, Morty whispered, They're copying us, you know. Look at them. Rick followed his gaze. The two smallest children were sitting the same way, cross-legged, heads tilted, mirroring them perfectly. Rick exhaled, a soft laugh escaping him. Of course they are. Mimicry, classic adaptive learning. Probably how they communicate empathy. Or maybe... He paused, eyes glinting. Maybe they just think we look peaceful. Morty smiled, his eyelids growing heavy. The hum felt like a lullaby wrapping around him, pulling him slowly toward rest. Rick stayed awake longer. He adjusted one of the pods, then another, making sure the frequencies stayed balanced. But even he couldn't resist the calm for long. His movement slowed, his breathing evened out. For the first time in years, Rick Sanchez fell asleep in his lab, not from exhaustion, not from alcohol, but from peace. The alien children watched over him, their hum lowering to a whisper. Machines dimmed their lights. Tools powered down. The entire garage exhaled. Outside, the stars shimmered a little brighter, as if the universe itself had paused to listen. And somewhere between science and song, between guilt and forgiveness, the old man and his grandson dreamed under the same gentle hum that had begun to change them both. It began quietly, as all important things do. One soft morning, when the air smelled faintly of metal and dew, Morty woke to find the children gathered around him. Their glowing forms hovered close, their eyes like tiny orbs of reflected dawn. They weren't humming this time. Instead, they pulsed, light rising and falling with his breath, as though they were waiting for him to notice something he'd forgotten. Rick was still asleep in the lab chair, his head tilted back, a small patch of drool marking his chin. Morty smiled at the sight. A rare, peaceful Rick, lost somewhere between dreams and equations. The lab around them still shimmered faintly from the night before, the pods glowing like small moons at rest. Morty sat up, rubbing his eyes. The nearest child reached out, touching his hand. Instantly, a faint vibration ran through him, a soft wave of warmth that wasn't physical but emotional. And then, just for a heartbeat, the lab disappeared. He was standing in sunlight. Not this cold blue light of Earth's morning. No, it was warm, golden, alive. He heard laughter. His mother's laughter, unguarded and young. She was spinning him around in the yard, a plastic bubble gun in her hand, both of them surrounded by orbs of soap and color. And then it was gone. The memory popped like the bubbles themselves. Morty gasped, clutching his chest. The alien child stepped back, watching him with wide, glowing eyes. Its expression wasn't fear or confusion. It was compassion, deep and endless. "Rick," Morty called out. His voice trembled slightly, a mix of awe and disbelief. "Rick, wake up." Rick stirred, groaning. "If it's another existential crisis, Morty, it can wait until after coffee." "No, seriously. The kids, they just showed me something. A memory or a dream, I don't know." That got his attention. Rick blinked the sleep away and turned toward Morty, his face unreadable. "What kind of memory?" Morty hesitated. "It was real. My mom. When I was little. I don't even remember that day, but it felt so clear. Like it wasn't gone, just waiting for me." Rick's expression darkened, but not with anger. With something gentler, something closer to fear. He rubbed his temples, muttering, "Bioluminal resonance. Memory triggers through emotional frequency. They're not just syncing empathy, they're syncing time inside your brain." Morty frowned. "You mean they can make you remember stuff?" Rick exhaled. "Not exactly. They don't make you remember, they let you. The hum connects to emotional imprints. Moments charged with feeling stored deeper than thought. They're not showing you the past. They're showing you yourself." Morty blinked, unsure what to say. The alien children gathered in a small circle now, hands linked, a soft humming starting again. It wasn't a song, it was like a frequency of remembrance. The light around them shimmered in rhythm with each note. Rick stood up slowly, watching. Morty noticed the tightness in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched. There was something in the air, a tension that wasn't just scientific curiosity. It was personal. "Rick, have you tried it?" Morty asked quietly. Rick didn't answer at first. His eyes flicked toward one of the pods glowing faintly blue, the same one he'd been staring into the night before. The hum grew louder, more intimate. Morty followed his gaze, and for a brief second, he saw something move within the light. A shape, a silhouette. A woman's voice, distant, laughing faintly before fading again. "Rick," Morty whispered, realization dawning. "They showed you. Her, didn't they?" Rick's hand trembled just slightly before he shoved it into his coat pocket. "They didn't show me anything. I'm just making sure the resonance is stable." But Morty heard the quiet waver in his voice, the kind that happens when truth and grief collide. The children's humming softened again. Morty reached out his hand toward them. This time the connection was gentler, almost like a heartbeat pressed to his palm. Another memory unfolded, not of joy but of something simple and human, sitting in the back seat of a car, staring at raindrops crawling across the window. His father and mother talking softly in the front, their words blurred by the hum of the road. He couldn't remember the words, but he remembered the feeling, that sense of safety, fleeting and fragile. When the memory faded, Morty felt tears at the corners of his eyes. He didn't know why. The children's light dimmed slightly, as though respecting the quiet ache of what they'd awakened. Rick had turned away. His eyes were fixed on his workbench, but his shoulders had slumped. Memories, he muttered, are dangerous. They trick you into thinking the past meant something different than it did. It's nostalgia, Morty, emotional static. Doesn't fix anything. Morty frowned. Yeah, maybe. But maybe it doesn't have to fix anything. Maybe it's just there to remind you what mattered. Rick looked at him then. Really looked. For a moment, the old arrogance flickered away. You sound like someone who hasn't lived long enough to regret anything. Morty smiled faintly. And you sound like someone who's forgotten what it's like to miss something. The hum deepened again. For a moment, the two stood in silence, surrounded by soft light and pulsing warmth. The alien children moved closer, their glow reflecting in Rick's tired eyes. He reached out almost involuntarily, and the air around him shimmered. His mind, always locked behind logic, flickered open. He saw fragments, not equations or blueprints, but moments. A young Beth holding his hand. The laughter of a woman long gone. The sound of a baby crying. The memories came not as punishment, but as grace, gentle, forgiving, real. Rick inhaled sharply, breaking the connection. Enough, he said softly. Not angry, just fragile. The children stopped humming. The air settled. Morty didn't speak. He knew better now. For a long while, Rick stood there in silence. Then he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Guess I built a lab full of lullabies, huh? Morty smiled sadly. Yeah, but maybe that's not a bad thing. Rick glanced at him, and for the faintest moment something almost like a smile touched his face. Don't get used to it, Morty. But the warmth in his tone betrayed the words. That night, as they left the lab, the hum of the children followed them into sleep. Faint, like the sound of stars remembering their first light. And somewhere in that sound, a small part of Rick Sanchez began to heal. That night, the sky above the citadel was a strange shade of violet. Clouds drifted like bruises, their edges shimmering with faint electric veins. Morty sat on the edge of the platform, legs dangling over the glowing abyss below, lost in thought. The humming of the alien children had faded with the sunset, leaving only the distant echo of citadel machinery and the soft, rhythmic tap of Rick's tools behind him. Rick was working again, or pretending to. He always did this after moments of vulnerability, burying emotion beneath circuits and equations, like a magician trying to hide the trick from himself. But even from a distance, Morty could tell something in him was different, quieter. He moved slower. More careful. Rick, Morty called softly. You've been staring at that same wire for 10 minutes. Rick grunted, not looking up. That's called thinking, Morty. Some of us still do that. Morty hesitated, then stood and walked closer. The lab was half lit, strewn with strange devices. A broken portal gun, a half-empty bottle, and something new. A metallic frame shaped vaguely like a heart, suspended in liquid glass. It pulsed faintly, as though alive. What is that? Morty asked. Rick sighed. A project I never finished. Not that it matters, Morty leaned closer. It looks alive. Yeah, Rick muttered. That's the problem. He turned away, grabbing a cloth to wipe his hands, but his reflection in the metal caught Morty's eye. There was something raw there, something stripped of his usual sarcasm. A man staring not at his creation, but at his own reflection in it. Rick, Morty said carefully, what did they show you? Back with the kids. What did you see? Rick froze. The silence stretched out like a wound that didn't want to be touched. He finally exhaled, long and tired, and leaned against the bench. You ever notice, Morty, how memory and pain use the same wiring? The brain doesn't know the difference. It just replays the shock and calls it nostalgia. Morty said nothing. He waited. Rick continued, voice low. When those things connected to me, I saw her, Diane, not the way I usually remember. Not in the moment she died, not in the mess that came after. I saw her laughing. I saw Beth as a kid, running circles around us with chalk in her hands. I saw a house that doesn't exist anymore. It's all too clean, too kind. Feels like a lie, but... He stopped, swallowing hard. It's the only version I still want to believe in. The room felt smaller suddenly. The hum of the citadel outside was muffled, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Morty stepped closer, softer now. Rick, you don't have to keep punishing yourself for things you couldn't change. Rick laughed, sharp and bitter. Couldn't change? Morty, that's the thing. I did change them. I rewrote universes. I swapped timelines. I built a goddamn multiverse to avoid remembering what I lost. You don't get it. When you can remake reality, the only thing left to ruin is yourself. He turned, grabbing the bottle from the table, but didn't drink. He just stared at it, as though the glass might answer him. Morty didn't speak. He'd learned that with Rick, silence was sometimes the only kind of mercy that worked. After a long pause, Rick sighed and set the bottle down. You know what's funny? Those kids, the humming, it's not just some alien lullaby. It's memory therapy. They're a species that evolved to heal each other's grief through shared recollection. They don't speak in words. They sing what others have lost. Morty's eyes widened. So they were trying to help you? Rick gave a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, which makes them either the kindest or dumbest creatures I've ever met. He leaned back, staring at the heart-shaped device again. I tried to build something like that once, years ago. Thought I could bring Diane back. Not her body, just her consciousness. A simulation based on memory echoes. I spent decades refining it, but the longer I worked, the less real she became. Turns out love doesn't survive data compression. Morty swallowed. The glow from the machine flickered faintly, casting ripples of light across Rick's face. For a second, Morty thought he saw tears but maybe it was just reflection. Why'd you stop? Morty whispered. Rick chuckled darkly. Because she asked me to. Morty blinked. Wait, what? Rick tapped his temple. One night, while running a memory sim, she spoke. Not a recording, not an echo, just her voice. Let me rest, Rick. That's what she said. And for once I listened. The words hung in the air like a ghost that refused to fade. Morty looked down, unsure what to say. The weight of that confession was too heavy for the silence between them. After a while, Rick picked up a wrench and began idly turning it in his hands. You know, Morty, people think I'm afraid of death, but I'm not. I'm afraid of remembering what I've already lost. Morty's voice was soft. Maybe that's the same thing. Rick paused, staring at him. For once, he didn't correct him. Didn't mock him. Didn't deflect. He just looked tired. Then, from the other side of the lab, a faint hum began to rise. The alien children awake again, their soft blue light spreading through the glass walls. Their glow reflected in Rick's eyes like tears disguised as starlight. Morty turned toward them. They're calling you again. Rick shook his head. No, they're calling you. Morty frowned. Why me? Rick set the wrench down, eyes narrowing with something between worry and awe. Because you still believe memories can save people. They know that. They feel it. Morty glanced back at the children. Their light pulsed brighter, gentle and inviting. Are you going to stop me? He asked. Rick hesitated. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked down, exhaled. No, Morty, just be careful what you remember. Some things are better left asleep. Morty nodded slowly and stepped toward the glow. As he did, the light surrounded him, warm, almost maternal. The hum deepened into a melody, strange yet soothing, as if thousands of forgotten voices were singing through time. For a heartbeat, Rick watched from the shadows, the great scientist, the universe's smartest man, standing powerless against something he could neither measure nor destroy, the gravity of memory. And in that hum, in that glow, Morty vanished, not gone, not lost, but remembered. Rick turned away, muttering to himself, Guess some kids never learn, but his voice trembled. And when he looked up, a single tear had escaped, catching the violet light of the Citadel sky, like a tiny, falling star that refused to die. There are nights when the Citadel feels endless, a maze of cold steel and forgotten light. But this night was different. For the first time in what felt like centuries, something soft began to bloom in its shadows. Rick's lab, once a sanctuary of logic and machinery, had begun to change. The alien children's hum had soaked into every wall, every wire, every circuit. Even the old fluorescent bulbs had started to flicker in rhythm with their song. It was as if the entire lab was learning to breathe. Morty woke before dawn to find Rick outside, standing ankle-deep in the dew-covered grass of the courtyard, or what used to be grass. Now it shimmered faintly, like each blade had been dusted with starlight. Around him, strange floating petals drifted through the air, glowing blue and violet. The air smelled faintly of ozone and lilac. Rick? Morty whispered, stepping closer. What is this place? Rick didn't turn. He was staring up at something suspended in the air. A vast, spiraling structure of soil, roots and light, spinning slowly like a dream in motion. It wasn't tethered to anything. It just floated, humming softly with the same resonance as the Alien Children's song. It's a biogravitic ecosystem, Rick said quietly. Self-sustaining, emotion-reactive, built from their resonance frequency. Every plant here grows according to emotional output. Morty blinked. You mean it feels stuff? Rick smirked faintly. Yeah, I guess you could say it's the universe's first mood garden. Morty took a step closer, mesmerized. Flowers opened as he approached, petals unfolding in glowing ripples as if welcoming him. When he smiled, the light grew warmer. When he exhaled, the vines swayed gently, responding to his breath. Whoa, Morty whispered. They like me, Rick chuckled, a soft, rare sound. They like everyone who means well. It's their survival mechanism. They feed on empathy. Morty looked up. The entire floating garden was alive with movement, luminous ferns unfurling mid-air, tiny pollen orbs drifting like fireflies, translucent vines wrapping gently around each other in slow motion. It wasn't chaotic. It was peaceful, like the world was exhaling after holding its breath too long. Rick turned toward him, wiping his hands on his coat. They needed somewhere to grow. The Citadel's too sterile. I built this for them and for the kids. They can't stay in the pods forever. You built this overnight? Morty asked, still staring in awe. Rick shrugged. Time's relative when you don't sleep. Morty smiled faintly. You mean when you can't sleep? Rick didn't answer. He only adjusted a small dial on his wristband, and the floating garden shifted slightly, rotating until its light fell perfectly across the children's pods. One by one, the pods began to open, and the children stepped out, quiet, shimmering figures made of soft light and translucent skin. Their eyes reflected galaxies. They looked around in wonder, and then they hummed. The sound wasn't loud, but it spread through the air like a sunrise. Flowers bloomed instantly. The air grew warmer. The entire garden brightened with living color, and Rick, for once, didn't flinch. He just stood there, arms crossed, eyes glassy from the light. Guess they approve, Morty said with a grin. Yeah, Rick muttered. Miracle workers with no mouths. Figures. Morty glanced at him. You like them, don't you? Rick raised a brow. They're biological phenomena, Morty. Don't get sentimental. But Morty saw the truth in his expression, that subtle softness that Rick tried so hard to disguise behind science. His eyes lingered on the children as they wandered among the floating plants, touching the leaves, smiling wordlessly, their light pulsing in time with the garden's glow. He didn't see test subjects. He saw something he hadn't felt in years, harmony. For a long time, no one spoke. The hum of the garden filled everything, not loud but deep, resonant, like the sound of a world healing from within. Finally, Rick exhaled. When I was younger, I built machines to destroy, to control, to prove I could. But this... He gestured around. This is the first thing I've made that doesn't need me to function. It just is. Morty smiled softly. Maybe that's the point. Rick looked at him. The point? Yeah, Morty said. Maybe some things are meant to live without you running the math. Maybe they just need you to care. Rick snorted, though his smirk was gentle. Care, huh? I'll add that to the list of experimental variables. Morty laughed quietly, shaking his head. You're impossible. Yeah, Rick replied, but consistent. The two stood in silence again, watching the children play. One of them, the small blue one Morty had bonded with, floated closer. It reached out a small hand, glowing faintly, and touched Morty's chest. A soft hum vibrated through him, filling his lungs like a song he'd forgotten. The air shimmered around them. Rick's eyes widened slightly as the readings on his wristband spiked. Huh, they're syncing with you again. What's that mean? Morty asked, voice trembling with awe. It means, Rick said quietly, they trust you. The child's hum deepened, and suddenly the garden reacted. The vines curled upward, flowers pulsing brighter, entire sections of the floating mass rising higher into the sky. It was as if Morty's calmness, his empathy, was feeding the system itself. The hum turned harmonic, spreading through the citadel like a heartbeat, and then something beautiful happened. All around the citadel, lights flickered on. Not mechanical ones, emotional ones. People began to stir from uneasy dreams. Neighbors who hadn't slept in years found themselves lulled by an unseen melody. Machines that had been fighting their own programming paused, recalibrated, and fell silent. The hum of peace was spreading outward, carried on invisible waves. Rick stared at the readings in disbelief. They're affecting the whole station, lowering stress responses, neutralizing aggression. They're basically reprogramming empathy. Morty smiled, the glow reflecting in his eyes. So, they're fixing people. Rick hesitated. No, not fixing, reminding. The words hung in the air, heavy and light at once. Morty nodded slowly. You think they can heal you too? Rick looked away, gazing up at the glowing vines spiraling above. I think some wounds don't close, Morty, but maybe they can make the bleeding feel like breathing. Morty didn't press further. He just stood beside his grandfather, shoulder to shoulder, both of them bathed in the soft celestial light of the floating garden. For once, the silence between them wasn't awkward. It was sacred. The children danced in the air, the vines swayed, and the hum deepened until it sounded like the whole universe was sleeping again. That night, the citadel stopped being a fortress. It became something else, something alive, something gentle. And though Rick never said it out loud, he stayed up long after Morty fell asleep, sitting in the garden's glow, muttering softly to no one in particular. Diane would have loved this. Every story of light finds its way beyond the walls that try to contain it. Even the smallest glow, the kind born in silence, always travels farther than it should. That was what happened after Rick built the floating garden. Its hum, gentle and steady, began to slip through the cracks of the Smiths' backyard fence, drifting across the quiet suburban night like invisible mist. It reached the curtains of sleeping homes, brushed against window panes, and lingered just long enough to be felt, not heard. It began with Summer. She had been lying awake again, scrolling through endless glowing screens, chasing distraction from thoughts she couldn't name. The light from her phone blurred into the faint blue glow outside her window. At first, she thought it was the neighbor's porch light, but then she noticed it was pulsing, slow, rhythmic, like breathing. She turned off her phone, and for the first time in weeks, the silence didn't feel empty. She walked to the window, her bare feet whispering against the wooden floor. The glow outside was unreal. Soft tendrils of bioluminescent light curling through the trees, swaying as if caught in a gentle tide. It painted her room in strokes of deep blue and silver. Summer leaned her head against the glass and whispered, "Rick." But there was no answer. Only that hum, low, soothing, endless. The kind of sound that makes you forget where your thoughts begin and end. It wasn't just in her ears. It was in her bones. That night Summer fell asleep faster than she had in years. She dreamed of stars singing underwater. By morning, she wasn't the only one. Across the street, Mr. Jenkins, who hadn't slept a full night since his wife passed away, found himself waking refreshed, tears still glistening on his cheeks. The dog next door, usually restless and barking through the night, now lay curled peacefully by the fence. Even the neighborhood's smart sprinklers, notorious for misfiring at 3 a.m., began running perfectly, synchronized with the rhythm of the hum. The neighborhood didn't talk about it at first. It just felt different, calmer, slower, kinder. People held doors open longer. Car horns were quieter. Conversations paused for birdsong. Something unseen was washing over everything, softening the edges of daily life. Rick noticed it first through the readings on his devices. The empathy field, as he'd begun to call it, was expanding beyond his garden. He stood in the backyard, watching data flicker across the holographic screen projected from his wristband. Every measurement glowed green, reduced cortisol levels, stabilized biofeedback, synchronized dream frequency. He grunted. Well, crap. I might have accidentally fixed suburbia. Morty laughed behind him. That's a bad thing. Rick scratched the back of his neck. It's unnatural. People don't just get better because of a mood hum. There's always a cost. Morty tilted his head. Maybe not this time. Rick frowned, gazing at the horizon where the glow faded into dawn. Don't be naive, Morty. Balance doesn't come free. Still, he couldn't deny what he felt. The air itself was easier to breathe, the light less harsh, even his own heartbeat slower. For the first time in a long time, the chaos inside his mind wasn't drowning him. It was humming a softly in tune. By noon, curious neighbors started peeking over the fence. The old lady from 2 houses down baked cookies and left them by the Smith's mailbox with a note that said, "Whatever you're growing back there, keep growing it." Summer watched Rick try to brush off the attention, muttering about nosy humans and privacy violations, but she saw him pocket the note anyway. That evening, the family gathered outside, drawn by the strange peace that seemed to hang over everything. Beth poured herself a glass of wine, Jerry attempted to fix a squeaky lawn chair, and Summer lay in the grass, staring up at the floating vines that shimmered like an aurora. Morty sat beside the small blue alien child, both of them humming softly together. The sound was so gentle it might have been mistaken for the wind, but it carried something deeper, a frequency of contentment that made the heart unclench. Beth turned to Rick. "I don't know what you've done this time, Dad, but it's..." "Nice," Rick shrugged, eyes still on the floating garden. "Yeah, well, give it a week. Nice things don't last." Summer rolled onto her side, smiling faintly. "You always say that, but what if this one does?" Rick didn't respond. He only stared up at the vines, watching them breathe, pulse, live, and for once didn't reach for his flask. Later that night, Morty found Rick sitting alone on the porch steps. The hum of the garden filled the silence between them, laced with the occasional chirp of crickets. The air was heavy with the scent of glowing pollen and damp soil. "Grandpa Rick," Morty asked softly, "do you ever think, maybe this is what you were meant to do?" Rick didn't look at him. What, play intergalactic babysitter to some sentient nightlights? "No," Morty said, smiling. "Make the world quieter," Rick snorted. "World doesn't need quiet, Morty. It needs reason, structure, physics." Morty tilted his head. "You sure about that?" "'Cause I think people are sleeping better. I think maybe they just needed peace." Rick sighed and rubbed his temple. "Peace doesn't exist. It's just the moment between 2 disasters." "Maybe," Morty replied gently, "but it's still a moment worth having." Rick looked at him then. Really looked. The kid wasn't trembling with fear or caught up in anxiety like usual. He was calm, centered. His shoulders weren't tense and his eyes held something Rick hadn't seen before. Quiet, understanding. For a flicker of a second, Rick almost said, "Thank you." But instead he muttered, "You sound like a fortune cookie," Morty chuckled. "Maybe the universe finally cracked one open for you." Rick rolled his eyes, but there was a small, tired smile beneath them. "You're getting real philosophical for a kid who still forgets where the butter is." Morty shrugged. "Maybe it's the hum talking." Rick leaned back against the steps, gazing at the glowing vines swaying against the stars. "If it is, I hope it never shuts up." By midnight, the neighborhood was wrapped in stillness. Streetlights dimmed as if bowing to the soft luminescence of the floating garden. Fireflies drifted lazily through the air, their movements syncing with the hum's rhythm. The moon hung low, full and golden, like it was listening too. Inside their rooms, everyone slept deeply. Dreams came, slow, tender, unhurried. Even Rick, whose mind was usually a storm of equations and ghosts, found his thoughts dissolving into something simpler. The hum was there, pulsing softly in the dark. It reminded him of something ancient and human, something he hadn't felt since holding a tiny baby girl in his arms, decades ago, when the world still felt redeemable. The floating garden breathed. The neighborhood dreamed. And for once, peace didn't feel like an illusion. It felt like a promise. There are some connections that form without a single word. They arrive softly, like a tide returning to shore, not dramatic, not loud, just certain. For Morty, it began on one of those late nights when the world felt unusually calm. The floating garden still glowed faintly in the backyard, humming its endless lullaby. The air was cool, heavy with summer's slow exhale. Rick had long since fallen asleep on the couch, flask dangling loosely from his hand, the TV murmuring static. Morty slipped out quietly, barefoot on the damp grass. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the hum. Maybe it was the way the night sky looked like it was breathing. Or maybe it was the feeling that someone or something was waiting for him. In the center of the garden, the alien children sat in a small circle, their skin glimmering like liquid moonlight. Each one radiated its own hue, soft green, pale violet, gentle blue, the kind of colors that don't exist during the day. They didn't speak, but they noticed him immediately, all except one. One of them sat apart, a smaller figure with translucent pale blue skin and eyes that shimmered faintly like starlight trapped beneath water. It wasn't humming. It was just still. Watching the others but never quite joining in, Morty hesitated, then walked closer. "Hey," he whispered, unsure if it would understand. "You okay?" The small being tilted its head slightly, eyes reflecting him back, not as a boy but as a shape of light and warmth. Morty's chest tightened. He didn't know why, but he felt seen. He sat down in the grass beside it, not too close, just enough to share the air. The hum around them softened, and for a moment he swore the stars above shifted. Leaning in, listening. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The creature closed its eyes and released a faint note, a single hum that trembled through the air like a ripple in water. Morty felt it vibrate through his chest, then fade. Without thinking, he breathed out softly in response, almost like a sigh, almost like an answer, and somehow it was one. The small being smiled, or maybe the light around its face just changed shape, and hummed again, this time longer, softer. Morty followed the rhythm, breathing in sync. The sound wasn't music exactly. It was something deeper, a feeling that bypassed words entirely. The grass beneath them swayed gently as if alive. The garden's light dimmed to match their breath. Somewhere inside the house a wind chime moved, even though the air was still. For the first time in forever, Morty didn't feel small. He didn't feel like a kid stuck in someone else's shadow, or a bystander in Rick's endless experiments. He felt real, centered, connected. An hour might have passed, or maybe 5 minutes. In that strange in-between space, time didn't seem to matter. The being reached out a small, luminous hand, hovering it just above Morty's. He didn't flinch. Instead, he placed his hand beneath it, feeling the warmth without touch, and in that silence, something inside him eased. The ache of uncertainty. The loneliness that came from living in a world too fast and too loud. It melted away like snow in sunlight. He thought of all the times he'd followed Rick into chaos, planets burning, people screaming, iron universes collapsing, and how none of it ever felt real. But this small quiet connection with a creature that didn't even speak, felt more meaningful than any of it. It was empathy without translation. It was peace without explanation. From the porch, unseen, Rick watched. He stood in the shadows, flask in hand, gaze steady but unreadable. He didn't interrupt. He didn't scoff or make a joke. He just observed the rhythm, the boy breathing beside the being, their harmony pulsing gently in the air. For a long moment, something stirred in him, a faint memory of holding a small hand, decades ago, under a sky that hummed with a different kind of life. He took a slow sip, the taste of metal and regret heavy on his tongue. Then he turned back inside, muttering to himself, "Guess the kid finally found a frequency that makes sense." The nights that followed were quieter. Morty and the pale blue child would sit together beneath the garden's glow, not always humming, sometimes just existing side by side. The rest of the children played gently in the background, but these two shared a stillness that the others didn't. Summer noticed it from her window. The way Morty looked calmer, his movements slower, his shoulders relaxed. Even Beth mentioned it over breakfast. "He's different," she said. "Peaceful." Rick only grunted, pretending not to care. But when no one was looking, he adjusted the lab's sensors to monitor their heart rates. What he saw made him pause. Their pulses were synchronized, perfectly. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled. "Well," he muttered, "that's either the creepiest or most beautiful thing I've ever seen." On the fourth night, Morty spoke softly, breaking their usual silence. "Do you ever miss wherever you came from?" The being tilted its head, eyes flickering faintly. Then, with slow movement, it pointed upward, toward the star, and then toward Morty's chest. He blinked. "Both?" A faint hum, almost like laughter, rippled through the air. Morty smiled. "Yeah, I miss both too." They stayed there until dawn. The sky turned pale, birds began to stir, and the hum of the garden softened into the rhythm of morning. As Morty stood to leave, the small being reached out again, placing its glowing hand near his heart. The air shimmered briefly. Morty felt something warm settle inside him, like a spark taking root. He didn't understand it, not yet. But he knew this. The connection they shared wasn't temporary. It was something that would follow him long after the stars faded. Inside, Rick sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by empty beakers and glowing readings. He looked up as Morty entered, barefoot, half smiling, eyes heavy with sleep but shining faintly with that same strange glow. Rick said nothing. Morty said nothing. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full. And somewhere outside, the small blue child hummed once, a soft, low note that echoed like a heartbeat. Rick finally whispered, almost to himself, "Guess the universe still knows how to write lullabies." Morty smiled. "Guess we're finally listening." The morning light stretched across the floor, touching the edge of Rick's flask, glinting off the lab door, then spilling out toward the floating garden. The hum answered softly, a soundless promise that connection once found never really fades. Rick Sanchez never liked silence. It made him think too much, and thinking too much was dangerous. But tonight silence filled the lab like a soft fog, humming faintly through the cables and glass tubes. The alien children slept in their floating pods, emitting faint rhythmic glows that pulsed like dreams breathing. Morty had fallen asleep on the couch upstairs again, one arm draped over a pillow. That faint glow from the night before still flickering near his heart. Rick sat alone, elbows on the desk, chin resting on his hands. The monitors around him flickered softly, each showing a different child's neural pattern. But his eyes weren't on the data. They were somewhere else entirely. He was remembering something. A long time ago, maybe in another universe, he'd seen something like this before. Not the glow, not the hum, but the feeling. A connection so pure, so unfiltered, it bypassed science entirely. He once called it biological resonance. Others called it love. He had tried to measure it once. He failed. Now, as the readings pulsed gently in time with Morty's heartbeat upstairs, he wondered if he'd finally stumbled onto it again. Not through equations, but through something far quieter. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small silver device, one he'd built long before Morty was born. It was a resonance mapper, designed to translate emotional frequencies into visible energy waves. He hadn't used it in decades. "All right, let's see if the universe still hums," he muttered. He switched it on. A faint whir, then a flicker of blue light. The screen blinked, then steadied. A slow, rhythmic pulse like the world's quietest heartbeat. He adjusted the sensors toward the sleeping pods. The readings spiked gently. Each child had its own tone, subtle, unique, like musical notes existing on different planes. But one of them, in the smallest, the pale blue one Morty had bonded with, had a frequency that matched his grandson's almost perfectly. Rick froze. He stared at the overlap, two identical waves dancing in tandem, undisturbed. He ran the numbers again. Then again, same result. Morty and the child weren't just connected emotionally. They were linked at a molecular level, a shared rhythm, a shared frequency, maybe even shared energy. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. All right. That's either beautiful or horrifying. Probably both. The hum of the lab deepened. A few machines clicked softly as the data continued streaming. Rick stood, walking toward the pods, his lab coat brushing against the faint mist that hovered near the floor. He placed his hand on the glass of the pale blue child's pod. "What are you, huh? Some kind of cosmic empathy battery, or—" He paused, frowning. "Or are you just teaching my grandson something I couldn't?" The child stirred faintly inside, eyes flickering open. The glow in its chest pulsed once, and Rick felt the vibration run through the glass and into his bones. Not cold, not alien. Familiar. It reminded him of something he'd long forgotten. Holding Beth's hand when she was little. The weight of a quiet promise he never kept, he sighed. "You're messing with my head, kid." But even as he said it, he didn't step away. He stood there a long while, watching the child's breathing match his own, slow even, human. A faint knock came from upstairs. "Rick?" Morty's sleepy voice echoed down the hall. "You, still up?" Rick didn't answer. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve and adjusted a few dials. Morty walked in quietly, hair messy, eyes half open. "What are you doing?" "Science," Rick muttered. Morty squinted at the glowing screens. "You're scanning them?" "Observing." Morty walked closer, yawning. "Are they okay?" Rick hesitated. The easy answer, the one he usually gave, was, "Yeah, sure, whatever, they're fine." But tonight something softer came out. "They're more than okay," he said quietly. "They're teaching me something." Morty blinked. "Teaching you?" Like emotionally? Rick scoffed, but the sound lacked its usual bite. Yeah, don't make it weird, kid, just... Turns out the universe might actually have feelings. Go figure. Morty grinned faintly. Guess you're not as heartless as you pretend. Rick rolled his eyes. Don't push it, but then after a moment you felt it too, didn't you? When you were out there with that one kid. Morty nodded. Yeah, it's like... It didn't talk, but I knew what it meant. Like I could feel it thinking. Rick studied him for a long time. And what did it feel like? Morty hesitated. Peaceful. Like, I wasn't just me. Like I was part of something. Bigger but quiet, Rick's gaze softened. Huh? He looked back at the monitors. That's the same word your mom used once when she was your age. Morty tilted his head. What word? Peaceful. The lab fell silent again. The hum deepened, matching their breaths. A few hours later, after Morty had drifted back to sleep in the corner chair, Rick found himself recording a note, something he hadn't done in years. Experiment log 8:42 a.m., he began softly. Subject, emotional resonance field. Observation, connection between species appears symbiotic. The child amplifies empathy, memory, and... He paused, then whispered almost to himself, forgiveness. He stopped the recording, then looked over at Morty, sleeping peacefully. That faint glow still hovering near his heart. Guess it's not just science anymore, Rick murmured. He leaned back, exhaustion pulling at him. His eyelids fluttered, and for the first time in decades, Rick Sanchez, interdimensional traveler, scientist cynic, fell asleep in his own lab, surrounded by quiet light. The machines dimmed in sync, their lights pulsing slower and slower, until the only sound left was the soft, rhythmic hum of the alien children breathing. And somewhere deep in the glow of that strange garden, the small blue child smiled, its chest glowing just a little brighter. Outside, the night sky began to pale, a single star fading gently into morning. It felt for once like the universe was resting too. The night sky above the Smith household had never looked so still. Even the stars seemed to hold their breath. Rick sat alone in the floating garden he'd built weeks ago. That quiet, shimmering ecosystem suspended above the yard, glowing faintly with alien flora and slow-turning orbs of light. Below him, Morty slept near one of the pods, his head tilted toward the hum that filled the air like a soft blanket. But tonight, something was different. The hum had changed. It no longer felt like a lullaby. It felt like a calling. Rick noticed it first as a tremor in the instruments around him. Readings flickered. Gravitational fields wavered in the upper atmosphere. His portal gun, lying idle on the workbench, began to vibrate on its own, softly, steadily, as though answering an unseen signal. He leaned forward, squinting at the sky. "Don't you dare," he whispered. But the universe rarely listened to him. A thin line of white light appeared high above, and at first faint and still. Then it widened, stretching open like the slow blink of an enormous eye. From within that silent brilliance, something descended, smooth, silver, and calm. Not a ship in the traditional sense, but more like a tear in space folding inward. Morty stirred. "Rick, what's that?" Rick exhaled. "Company." The vessel touched down on the far side of the floating garden. It didn't crash, didn't blast, didn't roar. It landed, gentle, deliberate, reverent. Light rippled across its surface, changing colors with each heartbeat of the world. Rick's instruments went silent, unable to measure it. Then the air opened. Shapes emerged, tall, graceful figures, bathed in that same silver glow. They resembled the alien children, but older, steadier, as if time had stretched them into wisdom. Their eyes held galaxies. Their movements, a kind of sorrowful grace. They didn't walk so much as drift, leaving trails of faint starlight behind. Morty gripped Rick's sleeve. "Are they... their parents?" Rick's mouth twitched. "Not exactly, more like... they're echoes." The figures came closer, stopping at the edge of the platform. The smallest among them stepped forward, lowering its head slightly. The hum in the air shifted, softer now, warmer, almost human in tone. One of them spoke, though not with words. The sound entered Rick and Morty's minds like a thought too kind to resist. "They are not lost," Morty blinked. "Not lost, but..." "They came through a portal." "We thought they were sent," the voice continued. "They were sent to remind, to restore." Rick straightened, his usual sarcasm falling away. "Remind who?" "Restore what?" The figure turned its luminous gaze toward him. The stars in its eyes dimmed, like clouds crossing over the sun. "You know," for a long time Rick said nothing. The night seemed to lean closer, listening. Morty looked from the beings to his grandfather. "Rick, what do they mean?" Rick swallowed, his voice low. "I think they're talking about me." The figures moved closer to the pods. The alien children, sensing their presence, awoke, their lights glowing brighter, their hums joining into a soft harmonic chorus. The garden itself seemed to bloom again. Vines unfurled, petals opened. The very air shimmered in rhythm to the music of reunion. Morty watched, speechless, as one of the elder beings knelt and placed its hand upon a child's pod. The light between them merged, a radiant pulse that carried a strange sadness. "They came to mend what was broken," the voice echoed again, softer this time. "To bring balance to what was once undone." Rick stepped forward. "You think you can guilt-trip me with cosmic therapy?" "I didn't ask for this." The nearest figure turned to him, not angry, not stern, only understanding. "You didn't have to ask." Rick's voice faltered. "You don't know what I did." "We do." The hum deepened, vibrating through the floor, through the glass, through his chest. Rick looked around, the garden, the pods, Morty's wide eyes reflecting the light. It all felt suddenly too familiar, too close to something he'd buried long ago. "Rick," Morty whispered. "What are they talking about?" Rick looked away. "A planet? Years ago it was a test site. Emotional stabilization fields. I thought I could fix evolution, make empathy measurable, quantifiable. I didn't know they were sentient yet." Morty stared at him. "You destroyed them." Rick nodded slowly. "Not on purpose, but yeah, I wiped them out before they ever had the chance to speak." The hum wavered. The air dimmed. The figures lowered their heads in unison, not in anger but in mourning. Then the same calm, omnipresent voice filled the night again. Not all was lost. They became light. And from that light, these children were born. Rick's voice cracked. "You're saying they're them, the same beings?" "The last echoes," came the reply. "You created them, without knowing. Your machines turned what you destroyed into what you could one day feel." For once, Rick Sanchez, the man who mocked gods and outsmarted death, stood without words. He stared at the glowing children, his chest rising and falling too fast, his eyes reflecting their soft light. "I was just trying to understand," he whispered. "Now you can." The air shifted again. The elder beings turned toward the sky. Their forms began to dissolve, strands of light unraveling into the atmosphere. Before disappearing completely, one looked back, eyes fixed on Morty. "He remembers," it said, and Morty felt a warmth in his chest, a pulse that wasn't his own. "He will carry what you cannot," and then they were gone. The sky folded back into itself, sealing the wound in the stars. The hum slowly faded to a gentle echo. Rick stood there a long while, the night pressing quietly around him. Morty watched him, his grandfather, usually so unshakable, now small beneath the endless dark. "Rick," he began softly. But Rick didn't turn. His voice was barely audible. "They weren't wrong." Morty stepped closer. "You didn't mean to—" "That's not the point, Morty," Rick said. "Meaning doesn't erase what's done, it just dulls it." He took a slow breath and looked at the glowing pods where the alien children had fallen back into peaceful slumber. "They came to fix what I broke," he whispered. And somehow they did it without saying a word. The night air grew still again, holding the fragile peace like a secret. The stars twinkled faintly, not brighter, not dimmer, but steady, as if approving the quiet reckoning below. Morty leaned against the railing beside him. For a while neither spoke. Somewhere far away an owl called once and went silent. The hum of the garden resumed, soft, steady, almost forgiving. Rick finally murmured, "Guess even the universe gives second chances." Morty smiled faintly. "Yeah, guess it does." The stars listened and the light of the garden glowed a little warmer, as if agreeing with them both. The night after the visitors vanished was too quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of sleep or rest, but that strange silence that follows a truth spoken aloud, the kind that hums under your ribs and lingers behind your thoughts. Rick hadn't left the lab since. Through the windows, Morty could see the glow of flickering monitors, the rise and fall of blue light on Rick's face, and the constant motion of his hands, as if by working. He could outpace memory itself. Morty didn't try to stop him. He only listened. From the hall he could still hear the faint echo of the Alien Children's hum, softer now, almost like a heartbeat on the edge of sleep. Rick muttered to himself as he soldered, coded, rewired. Balance, they said. Restore what was broken. Great. Sure, no problem. I'll just fix the universe, Morty. Again. But even his sarcasm sounded brittle, like it could shatter if he spoke too loud. He paused. On the corner of the workbench, a small piece of glass shimmered. One of the leftover pods, empty now, its inside lined with faint residue that pulsed faintly in rhythm. Rick reached for it, but his hand stopped mid-air. He saw himself reflected in the curved surface, older than he remembered, eyes ringed with exhaustion and something gentler. Something close to regret. God, I really did it this time, he whispered. Later that night, Morty entered quietly. He brought a mug of cocoa. Not because Rick would drink it, but because it was what his mom used to do when things felt too heavy to talk about. Hey, Morty said, setting it down beside him. You should sleep. Rick didn't look up. Sleep's just what people do when they're pretending they can forget. Morty frowned. You can't keep doing this, Rick. Rick grunted. Sure I can. I've been doing it for 60 years. The machines hummed around them, casting slow-moving shadows on the floor. On the far wall, Rick had pinned old schematics, fragments of something labeled Project Resonance, Empathic Frequency Field. Morty stared at the designs, then at his grandfather. That's what you were building before. Before the planet? Rick sighed and rubbed his eyes. Yeah, thought I could stabilize empathy. Bottled emotion, predictable reactions, and no more wars, no more heartbreak. Thought I was fixing the biggest flaw in the galaxy, feelings. He gave a hollow laugh. Turns out that was the flaw, thinking I could fix it. Morty sat down across from him. The air smelled faintly of ozone and soldered metal. The visitors said they were what you made, right? That you didn't destroy them, not completely. Rick nodded slowly. Yeah, they're atoms, they're memories. The frequency of who they were, it didn't die. My machine scattered it, gave it somewhere to go. Eventually the energy formed those kids. Not life as we know it, but something more. Pure. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. I made life out of guilt, Morty. Do you know how twisted that sounds? Morty hesitated. Or maybe you made something out of love and you just don't want to admit it. Rick met his eyes, sharp at first, then softening. You're starting to sound like them. Morty shrugged. Maybe they were right. Hours passed. The glow of the lab dimmed as the night deepened. Outside, the garden still floated gently, its lights breathing with the rhythm of the sleeping alien children. Rick finally stood and walked toward the glass door overlooking the yard. The reflection showed both of them, Rick with his tired defiance, Morty with quiet empathy. He spoke without turning. You know what I keep thinking about, Morty? That day. The one I wiped from every log, every memory bank, every file. But I still see it. The way the air went quiet after the blast. The color the sky turned before it folded in on itself. I didn't just destroy a planet. I destroyed the sound of laughter. Morty stepped closer. Then maybe that's why they came back. To remind you of that sound, Rick gave a bitter smile. You really think the universe is that sentimental? Morty nodded. Yeah, I do. I think it's tired of people who aren't. Rick chuckled under his breath. You get that from me? No, Morty said softly. I get that from you when you're not pretending. For a long while, neither moved. The stars drifted quietly over the glass, reflections like slow snow. Rick placed a hand on the railing and stared at his fingers, scarred, trembling, real. Maybe they didn't come to punish me, he said finally. Maybe they came because they knew I couldn't forgive myself. Morty smiled faintly. So what are you going to do now? Rick looked back at the lab, the half-finished machines, the old tools, the quiet hum still echoing through the room. I think I'll stop fixing things for a while, he said. Start listening. The next morning, light poured softly into the house. Summer stood by her window, staring at the floating garden. It was glowing again, brighter, steadier, almost joyful. She didn't know why, but she smiled. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe without rushing. Downstairs, Beth poured coffee, humming a tune she couldn't place. Jerry read quietly beside her, his usual anxiety replaced by calm. The hum was everywhere, faint, soothing, like a memory you didn't know you needed. Rick stood outside, eyes half closed against the morning sun. He could feel it, the resonance, the pulse of something alive beneath the surface of everything. It wasn't science, it wasn't magic. It was simply peace. He turned as Morty joined him, hands in his hoodie pockets. "So, they're gone, huh?" Morty said. Rick nodded. "Yeah, but not really. You can still feel it if you stop trying." Morty listened. The hum was faint, but it was there, in the breeze, in the leaves, in the quiet between heartbeats. "Feels like they're still watching." Rick smiled faintly. "Nah, just teaching. The universe has a weird sense of mercy." They stood there a long while, neither saying much. The world moved around them, slow, kind, forgiving. At last, Rick murmured, "Guess this is what reckoning feels like." "Not fire and brimstone, just silence that finally makes sense." Morty nodded. "Yeah, the kind that doesn't hurt anymore." The hum swelled once, then softened, fading back into the air. And as the sun climbed higher, Rick took one long breath and let it out. Like a man finally setting down a weight he'd carried far too long. That night, the world felt lighter, not because it had changed, but because something inside it finally had. The air outside the Smith house was still, the kind of stillness that holds its breath after a storm. The stars hung low and soft, as though leaning closer to listen. Morty couldn't sleep. He lay on his back staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint patterns the moonlight made through his curtains. The hum, that strange, soothing vibration that had filled the world since the visitors arrived, was quieter now. But it was still there, hiding inside the silence. It pulsed faintly in his chest like a heartbeat not his own. He turned on his side, glancing at the clock. 3:07 a.m. Somewhere downstairs a floorboard creaked, Rick's footsteps slow, uneven. Morty sighed, grabbed his hoodie and went down. Rick was sitting outside in the yard. The floating garden was gone now, its lights extinguished, its vines gently folded back into the soil, as if it had never been. But the faint shimmer of something invisible still lingered, like heat above asphalt. Rick was staring at it, silent. A small bottle of something half-empty sat beside him, untouched. Morty hesitated. "Couldn't sleep either?" Rick didn't turn. "Sleep's for people who don't remember everything they've done." Morty sat beside him. "That's everyone, Rick." A long pause. The breeze stirred, carrying the scent of ozone and morning dew. Rick's eyes were bloodshot but softer than usual. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. "You know," Rick began quietly, "when I was your age, I thought silence was the enemy. I'd fill it with noise, inventions, chaos, people who didn't matter. Anything to drown out the sound of my own thoughts." Morty didn't speak, but now... Rick's voice drifted. "Now I think maybe silence was just waiting for me to listen." He took a deep breath. The sound trembled slightly. "They didn't just forgive me, Morty. They showed me what I'd forgotten, that the universe isn't broken because of chaos. It's broken because we stopped hearing each other." Morty watched the empty garden, his eyes catching the faint glint of dew where the alien light had once been. "They didn't really die, did they?" Rick shook his head slowly. "Nothing ever really dies, Morty. It just changes frequency." The two sat in silence. The world felt stretched thin, a quiet so deep it almost hummed. Somewhere in the distance, a faint, shimmering tone rose and faded, like a sigh too big for lungs. Morty closed his eyes. "You think they'll come back?" Rick smirked. "If they're smart, they won't. The universe doesn't repeat its lessons. It just waits for you to realize you already passed the test." He leaned back, staring at the stars. "You ever wonder, Morty, what happens when you run out of mistakes to fix?" Morty smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's time to just live." Rick laughed softly, almost like an exhale. "God, you sound like me 20 dimensions too late." The night deepened. Somewhere a bird sang a confused note, mistaking moonlight for dawn. The hum under the soil pulsed once, faintly, before settling again. Inside the house, everything was calm. Beth's breathing upstairs was steady. Summer's phone, still in her hand, glowed dimly, with a half-written message she'd fallen asleep composing. Something about forgiveness. Jerry snored faintly, his arm draped over the dog. Outside, time slowed. Rick reached for his flask, turned it in his hand, then set it aside. "Do you ever notice," he said, "how silence makes everything heavier? Every thought, every regret. It all weighs more when you're not running from it." Morty nodded. "Yeah, but it also makes things feel real." Rick looked at him, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "You're not supposed to be this wise, Morty. It's ruining my reputation, Morty chuckled. Guess somebody had to balance you out. For a while they just sat. The sky above them looked infinite again. Not as a curse, but as a promise. Then faintly the ground shifted. A soft vibration rippled through the earth, subtle and rhythmic. The same hum that had followed them for days. But this time it wasn't sorrowful. It sounded like a farewell. Rick and Morty turned toward the sound. The faint shimmer above the soil pulsed one last time, a breath, a heartbeat, and then dissolved into starlight. "They're gone," Morty whispered. Rick shook his head. "No, they're home." Later, Rick walked back inside, stopping at the threshold. His lab, once cluttered with machines and equations, was dark. The monitors were off. The air felt still. He stood there a long moment, then reached over and flipped the main breaker. The hum of the machines faded completely. Replaced by true silence, Morty blinked. "You just turned it all off?" Rick nodded. "Yeah, the smartest thing I've done in a while." He looked at Morty. "You know, for a long time I thought I was keeping the universe running. Turns out it runs just fine without me screwing with it." Morty smiled. "So what now?" Rick looked toward the dawn breaking faintly on the horizon. "Now I think I'll just listen for a while. Maybe find out what silence sounds like when it's not punishment." As the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, the house filled with a strange kind of peace. No tension, no chaos, no multiverse tearing at the seams, just morning. Beth woke to the sound of birds. Summer wandered into the kitchen, confused at how calm the world felt. Jerry smiled for no reason at all. And outside, Rick stood in the grass barefoot, eyes half closed. He could feel the hum again, not in the soil this time, but inside himself. Subtle, balanced, alive. For the first time in a very long time, Rick Sanchez didn't feel like he was running from the universe. He felt like he was part of it. He exhaled slowly, watching the breath curl in the air before fading into nothing. "Good night," he whispered, though the sun was already rising. Morty looked at him. "You mean good morning?" Rick smiled faintly. "Same thing, Morty. Just depends on where you're standing." They both watched the horizon. The silence that stretched between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was full of everything they'd lost, everything they'd learned, and everything they might still become. And as the world woke around them, the night of silence ended, not with a bang or a scream, but with a whisper that sounded almost like forgiveness. The morning after the silence felt different. The world seemed to exhale after holding its breath for too long. The air carried a faint sweetness, like the echo of something that once sang. The floating garden was gone, the hum was gone, and yet it felt as though the world itself remembered what it had heard. Rick hadn't slept. Morty could tell by the way his grandfather's eyes darted, too alert, too aware of the quiet. He'd spent the whole night staring into empty glass screens, rewatching data that no longer existed. The lab felt hollow, stripped of its light, stripped of purpose. Morty stepped inside quietly. "You've been here all night, huh?" Rick didn't answer. His fingers hovered over a console that wasn't powered. His lips moved slightly, murmuring something under his breath. Morty took a step closer. "Rick." The old man flinched slightly, not from fear, but from being pulled out of thought. He looked up at Morty, and for the first time in a long while his face carried something unguarded. It wasn't anger or exhaustion. It was sorrow. "They stopped humming," Rick said softly. "You ever notice that? You can get used to something you never understood. And then when it's gone, it hurts like hell." Morty didn't respond. He knew this wasn't the time for words. Rick exhaled, slow and uneven. "You remember when they first showed up? I thought it was another problem to fix. Another cosmic puzzle. But they weren't broken, Morty. I was." He laughed quietly, bitterly. "I kept telling myself the multiverse was chaotic, that everything was random. That's how I excused it. But what if it wasn't random? What if it was just reflecting me?" He rubbed his forehead as if trying to wipe away the thought. Morty hesitated. "You don't have to—" "Yes, I do," Rick interrupted sharply, then lowered his voice. "You think I don't know what I did? I built things that broke worlds. I called it science, but it was pride. I kept saying I was saving reality, but I was just trying to prove I could control it." His voice trembled, the kind of tremble Morty had only heard once before. The night Rick nearly erased himself from existence. "I thought emotion was weakness," Rick whispered. "I thought silence was failure. But those kids, they didn't fight. They didn't run. They just listened. He looked at his trembling hands, and for the first time I didn't have an answer. Just a noise I couldn't explain. Outside the morning was soft, light spilling across the yard where the seed Morty had planted still slept under the soil. Birds sang cautious at first, as if testing whether the world was safe again. The sky shimmered faintly, a residue of starlight that hadn't yet faded. Morty stepped beside Rick. "You can tell them, you know. The kids, even if they can't hear you anymore." Rick frowned. "They're gone." "Maybe," Morty said quietly, "but they heard everything before. Maybe they still can." Later that afternoon, Rick did something no one expected. He asked for silence. The whole family gathered in the yard. Beth, Summer, Jerry, Morty, they didn't understand what was happening. Rick didn't explain. He just stood there, hands shaking slightly, eyes distant. At first, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind. Then Rick cleared his throat. This is stupid," he muttered, rubbing his neck. "Talking to something that isn't here." He looked up at the sky. "But then again, I've spent my whole life talking to things that don't answer back. Machines, equations, alternate versions of myself. So what's one more?" He paused. The sarcasm faded. His voice softened. "I don't know what you are. Energy, emotion, some kind of harmonic consciousness, whatever. But you changed something. You changed me. And that's not easy to do." Morty watched quietly, holding his breath. Rick's tone wavered. "You showed me what it's like to feel without needing to fix. You showed me what it means to forgive." He swallowed hard. "I didn't deserve that." The silence deepened, like the world itself was listening. Rick continued, his voice almost breaking. "I'm sorry. For everything I broke, planets, families, people. I thought I could outsmart pain, but it just followed me through every portal. You stopped running, and I think that's what I need to learn now." He laughed weakly, a sound that cracked halfway through. "God, I sound like a Hallmark card." Morty smiled faintly but didn't interrupt. Rick took a deep breath. "So yeah, I'm sorry, and thank you." He closed his eyes. For a moment, nothing happened. Then faintly, so faintly it could have been imagination, the air began to vibrate. A low, gentle hum filled the yard. It came not from the sky, not from the ground, but from everywhere at once. Beth gasped softly. Summer covered her mouth. Even Jerry stopped breathing. Rick's eyes opened. His lips parted slightly as the sound wrapped around him. Familiar, forgiving, alive. It wasn't loud. It wasn't bright. But it was warm. Morty whispered, "They heard you." Rick didn't answer. Tears shimmered in his eyes, catching the golden light of afternoon. He looked up at the sky, no words left to say. The hum rose and fell like a heartbeat. Then slowly it began to fade, not disappearing but settling into everything. Into the wind, the trees, the soft rhythm of existence. When it was gone, the world didn't feel empty. It felt balanced. Rick exhaled shakily. "Guess that's that." Morty looked at him. "Are you okay?" Rick smiled faintly. The smallest, most honest smile Morty had ever seen. "No, but I think I might be becoming okay." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small broken piece of metal, the core of his old portal gun. He looked at it for a moment, then tossed it into the grass. Some things don't need fixing. The piece landed near the soil where the crystalline seed was buried. For a moment it glowed faintly, pulsing once like a heartbeat. Rick turned and walked back toward the house. Morty stayed behind, looking at the dirt. He thought he heard the faintest echo of the hum one last time, not as sound, but as feeling, a whisper in the quiet. "We forgive you," and for the first time, Morty believed that forgiveness wasn't something given. It was something learned. That night the stars above shimmered brighter than they had in months. Rick sat by the window, flask untouched, head resting against his arm. The hum no longer filled the air, but he could still feel it beneath everything, like the low vibration of life itself. He whispered, just once, "Thank you." And the silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt like peace. Morning arrived like a slow breath after a long, sleepless night. The Smith house, for the first time in weeks, wasn't filled with machines humming or portals flickering. There was only quiet sunlight, the kind that crept through curtains like a kind visitor who didn't want to wake anyone too soon. Rick sat by the window, still in his lab coat, though it looked less like armor now and more like an old blanket he'd forgotten to take off. His eyes were half closed, unfocused, following the dust particles as they drifted lazily in the beams of light. Each one seemed to carry a glimmer of yesterday's hum, a memory of something that had changed him. Morty entered quietly, still in pajamas, hair uncombed. He carried 2 mugs of coffee, one trembling in his hands. "Morning," he whispered. Rick blinked, turning slightly. "It's technically noon, Morty." "Yeah," Morty said, sitting down beside him. "Still feels like morning, though." The two of them sat in silence. Outside, the backyard glowed faintly, not from machines or alien lights, but from the natural shimmer of morning dew. The seed that Morty had planted weeks ago, the one left behind by the alien children, hadn't yet sprouted. But somehow the ground above it seemed warmer, alive in a quiet way. Rick sipped his coffee, grimaced, then looked at Morty. "You made this too strong," Morty shrugged. "Guess I learned from you." Rick chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Kid, if you ever start turning into me, slap yourself first." There was a comfort in their exchange. Small, familiar, unforced. The kind of comfort that comes not from words but from survival. From making it through something that could have broken you, and finding you still had someone beside you when it was over. Outside, the day began to change. The air shimmered, not from heat but from a faint resonance, as if the sky was remembering how to hum again. Beth walked into the kitchen, drawn by the light. She paused by the window, her breath catching. "Rick, Morty!" "Look at that." They followed her gaze. The sky, once pale blue, was awash with slow-moving color, pinks and silvers, soft yellows, streaks of lavender that moved like water over glass. Clouds drifted not with the wind, but with rhythm, as though the world itself was breathing in harmony. Morty stood, pressing his face to the window. "It's them," he whispered. "It's gotta be them." Rick stared quietly. "No, kid. It's us." Beth frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Rick's voice was low. "They didn't leave the hum behind to haunt us. They left it to remind us. This world's alive. Always was, we just forgot to listen." Outside, the light grew warmer. The sun peeked through the glowing veil of colors, scattering beams across the neighborhood. Summer walked in, yawning, eyes half open. "What's everyone staring at?" "The sky," Morty said. He stopped, because words didn't do it justice. Summer stepped closer, her expression softening as the color washed over her face. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Rick nodded slowly, barely audible. "Yeah, for once. It actually is." The family gathered outside, standing barefoot in the cool grass. The air hummed, faintly, peacefully. The same resonance that once filled Rick's lab now filled the open world. It wasn't artificial anymore. It was natural. The hum existed without origin, without machinery. It had simply become part of everything. Birds sang and their calls wove themselves into the rhythm. The leaves trembled as if in applause. Morty tilted his head, closing his eyes. "You hear that?" Rick glanced sideways. "You mean the wind?" "No," Morty said softly. "It's like laughter. But not out loud, more like it's laughing through everything." Rick didn't respond immediately. He just looked at Morty, really looked at him, and realized that somewhere between all the portals, all the mistakes, all the madness, this kid had grown up. "Yeah," Rick finally said. "Guess I hear it too." They stayed there for a long time, saying nothing, just breathing. Jerry brought out a folding chair and sat down awkwardly, muttering about how the sky's been weird before. But even he couldn't deny the warmth that filled the air. Beth took Summer's hand, and for once nobody rolled their eyes. Rick walked a few steps away from them, toward the center of the yard. The grass was damp beneath his shoes. He crouched down and touched the soil where the seed lay buried. For a moment he thought he felt it, a faint pulse like a heartbeat in the earth. "Still there," he whispered. Morty stepped up behind him. "Oh, you think it'll grow?" Rick straightened, squinting at the horizon. "Everything grows if you give it time." He said it almost absently, but the words hung in the air, gentle, hopeful, uncharacteristically human. As the light continued to shift, Rick reached into his pocket and took out a small object, the broken metal core of his old portal gun. He turned it over in his hands, watching it glint in the sunlight. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think this thing made me unstoppable. Turns out it just kept me from standing still." He looked at Morty and smiled faintly. Standing still's not so bad, Morty grinned. Yeah, it's kinda nice, Rick nodded. Then, without ceremony, he placed the metal core into the soil beside the seed and patted the dirt over it gently. A flicker of light pulsed under the surface. Once, twice, and then it was gone. By late afternoon, the glow in the sky had softened into something almost ordinary. But the family could still feel it, the resonance that hummed beneath conversation, beneath breath. Beth was the first to go inside, then Jerry, then Summer. Soon it was just Rick and Morty left in the quiet yard. Morty looked up. You think they'll ever come back? Rick took a long breath. Maybe not the way we expect. Maybe that's the point. Some things don't come back, they just stay in different forms, Morty smiled. Like light? Rick nodded. Like light. They watched the last shimmer fade from the clouds. The world returned to stillness, but it wasn't the same kind of silence. It was the kind that hums softly beneath everything, the silence of peace, not absence. Rick pulled his coat tighter around himself, then put a hand on Morty's shoulder. Come on, kid. Let's get some pancakes before your mom decides to experiment with kale again. Morty laughed, shaking his head. You're actually hungry? Rick smirked. Nah, just curious what normal feels like. They walked back toward the house, the sky behind them glowing faintly, soft pinks melting into blue. The hum was gone, but its warmth lingered in the air, like a promise. And as they disappeared inside, a faint shimmer rose from the soil, a spark, small and quiet, pulsing like the beginning of something new. The morning glow faded, but its memory didn't. It stayed in the rhythm of footsteps, in laughter at breakfast, in the small things that people forget to notice, and somewhere, far beyond the stars, a faint hum echoed back, gentle, eternal, grateful. Evening returned slower than usual, like the sky itself didn't want the day to end. The sunset stretched wide across the horizon, 1,000 soft colors melting together, rose gold, lavender, blue-gray, and the faint shimmer of silver left behind by the morning's strange light. The house was quieter than it had been in weeks. No machines running, no experiments humming, just the faint ticking of a wall clock and the gentle sound of wind brushing through the open windows. Morty sat on the steps of the porch, chin resting in his hands. His sneakers were untied. His thoughts, too. He wasn't sure how long he'd been sitting there. Maybe an hour, maybe all afternoon. Time felt different lately, softer somehow, like it didn't care about numbers anymore. He looked up as the first stars appeared. They didn't twinkle the way they used to. They pulsed, slow and steady, like heartbeats in the sky. Somewhere in his chest, Morty felt that same pulse echo back. Behind him, the door creaked open. Rick stepped outside, coat hanging loosely off his shoulders, a half-empty flask dangling from his fingers. You waiting for someone? He asked. Morty shook his head. Just thinking. Rick made a small grunt, the kind that could have meant anything, agreement, annoyance, or maybe something gentler he didn't know how to express. He sat beside Morty, lowering himself carefully like the act of sitting had become a ritual. The silence between them was comfortable. The kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled because it already means something. After a while, Morty spoke. You think they're okay? Rick didn't ask who they were. He didn't need to. Yeah, he said. They're not the kind of beings that vanish. They shift, move into the next layer of existence, maybe. Hard to explain without sounding like a scientist, Morty offered, smiling faintly. Rick snorted. Touché, kid. They both chuckled quietly, then fell silent again. The sound of crickets filled the space between them, rhythmic, calming. For the first time, it didn't bother Rick. Far above them, the stars began to change. Not all at once, but gradually. One by one, they aligned themselves into a pattern. Morty noticed first. Rick. Look, Rick squinted. The stars were glowing in an almost deliberate formation. Not letters, not words, but shapes. The faint outline of 5 small figures holding hands, light rippling between them like waves on calm water. The kids, Morty whispered. Rick's jaw tightened. Huh. The image shimmered softly, then began to fade as a faint hum rose in the air, the same tone that once filled his lab. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even sound, really. More like a feeling that touched every surface of the night. And then through the hum came a voice, gentle, layered, ageless. It wasn't in words, but both Rick and Morty understood it perfectly. Thank you. Morty's eyes widened. But Rick was already staring at the sky, eyes glassy. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and whispered, "Yeah, you're welcome." Moments later, a soft beam of light descended from the heavens, settling on the far edge of the yard. It wasn't blinding or dramatic, just a quiet ripple of brilliance bending the grass and making the air shimmer. From within it stepped the elder beings, the same ones who had come before. Tall, serene, with eyes that carried entire galaxies inside them. Their presence was both humbling and peaceful, like being near something sacred but kind. Rick stood, steadying himself, and muttered, "Guess this is it." Morty rose beside him. Heart heavy but calm, the lead figure stepped forward. When they spoke, their voice resonated not in sound but in feeling. The cycle is complete. The children have learned. And so have you. Rick tilted his head. You make it sound like I was the experiment. The being smiled softly, a gesture that felt older than time itself. You were. Rick let out a shaky laugh. Figures. The being's attention turned to Morty. You carry understanding, they said. Not knowledge, but empathy. That will guide you. Morty nodded, though his eyes glistened. Are they going to be okay out there? The being placed a hand, glowing, weightless, near his shoulder. They already are. Behind them, 5 smaller figures appeared. The alien children, luminous, familiar. Their forms flickered between shapes, between memories. Morty recognized one of them, the small pale blue child who had sat with him in the grass. The child smiled, eyes soft, and hummed a note so gentle it felt like a goodbye and a thank you all at once. Morty's throat tightened. Do you have to go? The child tilted its head, then touched Morty's chest lightly. You'll still hear us. When it's quiet enough. Rick took a step forward. He looked at the beings, then at the children. I don't do goodbyes, he said quietly. Never have. The lead figure's gaze met his. Then don't, just remember. Rick hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I can do that. For a long moment no one spoke. The only sound was the wind brushing through the grass, the faint hum of the world breathing. Then the light around the beings began to rise, swirling like mist. Morty reached out instinctively, as if to hold on to something invisible. Wait. The pale blue child turned one last time, smiling at him. Then, with a shimmer like falling snow, they dissolved into the beam of light. The air filled with warmth, not heat, but an emotional warmth, like being hugged by the universe itself. Rick stood still, head bowed, his flask dangling forgotten by his side. The light faded. The yard returned to its usual dark calm. Crickets resumed their song, unaware that the stars above had just shifted their course forever. Morty wiped at his eyes. They're gone. Rick's voice was low, hoarse. They were never meant to stay. Morty turned to him. You okay? Rick gave a small, uneven smile. I will be eventually. He paused, then added, You did good, kid. Real good. Morty blinked, caught off guard. You mean that? Rick nodded. Yeah, don't make me repeat it. Morty laughed softly, the kind of laugh that trembles at the edges. You know, I think they changed you. Rick smirked faintly. They changed everything. They stood side by side for a while longer, watching the stars. Somewhere in the distance, a soft echo of the hum lingered, so faint it could have been the wind, or maybe memory itself singing one last lullaby. Rick finally broke the silence. Come on, Morty, let's head in. It's getting cold. Morty nodded, but before following, he looked up once more. The stars were brighter tonight, warmer. Good night, he whispered to the sky. The stars pulsed once, gently, as if answering back. Inside, Rick closed the door behind them. The hum was gone, but its peace remained, woven into every corner of the house. As Rick walked toward his lab, Morty lingered in the hallway, feeling the air hum faintly against his skin. It wasn't the end of something. It was the continuation of something softer, quieter, the kind of ending that stays awake inside you long after the story fades. Morning came softly. The sunlight didn't crash through the blinds the way it used to. It seeped in, golden and weightless, coating the floor like melted amber. Dust floated in the air, glowing with every quiet beam. The house felt different, still, listening. Rick's footsteps echoed faintly down the hall. He hadn't slept. He rarely did, but this time, his sleeplessness didn't come from restlessness or the chaos of invention. It came from something quieter, the absence of sound. He stopped in front of the door to his lab. The metal was cold under his palm. For a long while he just stood there, breathing in, breathing out. Then, with a soft click, he pushed it open. The lab greeted him like a ghost of its former self. No hums, no sparks, no experiments mid-progress. Just rows of silent machines and scattered papers that no longer seemed important. The faint smell of ozone still lingered, mixed with the sharp metallic tang of old tools. Rick stepped inside slowly, his boots making small, hollow sounds against the concrete floor. He ran his fingers along the nearest workbench. The dust left streaks on his fingertips. "Empty," he murmured. "Didn't think I'd ever see the day." He found one of his older inventions sitting half-finished, a cylindrical device meant to bridge energy frequencies between dimensions. Once it had been his obsession. Now it just looked like a relic, a fossil of curiosity. He picked up a wrench and turned it idly, staring at his reflection in the dull metal. His eyes were tired, but softer than before, the kind of tired that comes after finally letting go. He set the wrench down and looked toward the far wall, where his old whiteboard still hung. Equations covered it, layers over layers of thoughts, arrows, symbols, circles. In one corner, Morty's handwriting stood out, a small doodle of a stick figure with Grandpa's brain machine scribbled underneath. Rick stared at it for a long time. Then, without quite realizing it, he smiled. Morty entered quietly a few minutes later, holding 2 mugs of coffee, one black, one pale with milk. He hesitated at the doorway. "Didn't want to interrupt," he said softly. Rick waved a hand without looking back. "You're not interrupting. You're existing. That's allowed." Morty smiled faintly and set the mugs down on the table. The smell of coffee curled through the room, rich and grounding. They stood side by side, both looking at the whiteboard. Morty spoke first. "You ever gonna erase it?" Rick shook his head. "Nah, not this one." "Some messes are worth keeping." Morty nodded slowly. "Feels weird in here now. Like it's waiting." Rick exhaled. "Maybe it's not waiting. Maybe it's just done. For now." He turned to Morty. "You ever finish something so big you don't know who you are without it?" Morty tilted his head. "Like when you finish a game you've been playing for months and the credits roll, and you just kinda sit there?" Rick chuckled quietly. "Yeah, exactly like that." They moved around the lab for a while, each lost in thought. Morty found an old photo tucked beneath a pile of schematics. It showed him and Rick, standing beside a half-built portal gun. Morty's hair was messy, his face streaked with grease. Rick had one hand on his shoulder, mid-sentence, eyes alive with something fierce. "Man," Morty said softly. "Look at us." Rick glanced over. "2 idiots trying to rewrite reality." Morty grinned. "We kinda did," Rick smirked. "Yeah, guess we did." He reached out and took the photo, holding it between his fingers like something fragile. For a moment the silence felt heavier. Not sad, just full. As the morning stretched into afternoon, they cleaned the lab in near silence. Not the frantic kind of cleaning that comes from guilt, but the calm kind that means respect. The kind you do when something sacred has ended. Morty stacked papers into neat piles. Rick organized the tools. Every sound, at every small clink or scrape, echoed softly in the room like a heartbeat trying to remember its rhythm. When Morty finished, he looked around. "You ever think about, what's next?" Rick paused. "Next?" "Yeah, like, if this was all supposed to happen, maybe there's something else we're supposed to do now." Rick leaned against the bench, crossing his arms. "You sound like a philosopher. Or worse, a motivational speaker." Morty rolled his eyes. "I'm serious." Rick thought for a moment, then said, "Maybe there isn't always a next. Maybe sometimes you just let the story breathe." Morty frowned slightly. "So, we just wait?" Rick shrugged. "You don't wait, you live." That's the part most people forget. For a long while, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of a clock somewhere upstairs. Slow, deliberate, grounding. Rick finally broke the quiet. "You know, Morty, when I started this whole thing, I thought knowledge was the point. I thought if I could understand everything, I could fix anything." Morty looked at him. "And now?" Rick's gaze drifted toward the whiteboard. "Now I think understanding's just the beginning. What matters is what you do after you understand." Morty nodded. "So what are you going to do now?" Rick gave a small, tired smile. "Maybe nothing. Maybe something simple. Like fix that damn porch light. Morty laughed, a real full laugh that echoed softly through the lab. That'd be a first. Rick smiled, and for the first time in a long time it didn't look forced. Don't get used to it. As the day faded into dusk, the lab glowed with golden light. The machines, though silent, caught the color beautifully, like old bones under a sunset. Rick sat at his bench, scribbling in a notebook. Not equations this time, but words. Small thoughts, observations. A kind of journal he would never admit was a journal. Morty watched him from the doorway. "You're writing?" Rick grunted. "Just notes." "Don't start thinking I'm sentimental," Morty smirked. Too late. Rick didn't look up, but a faint grin tugged at his lips. "Go get dinner started, will ya? And none of that microwave crap." "Real food tonight," Morty blinked. "You cooking?" Rick shrugged. "Guess we'll find out." When Morty left, Rick leaned back in his chair, pen still in hand. The lab was quiet again, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt full, like everything that had ever mattered was still here, invisible but real. He looked up at the ceiling. The hum was gone, yet he could almost hear it, faint and distant. Like memory turned to music, Rick whispered. "Yeah, I hear you." He closed his notebook, stood up, and turned off the lights. As he walked toward the door, the last rays of sunlight caught the whiteboard, making the faded equations glow briefly one more time, like a farewell wave from a universe that finally felt at peace. The door clicked shut behind him. The lab exhaled. Evening came softly to the Smith household, painting the yard in shades of violet and silver. The sky had that quiet weight it gets after something extraordinary, like the universe was catching its breath. Morty stood alone in the grass, where the children once hummed. The air still carried a faint shimmer, as if the world itself hadn't forgotten. He bent down, fingers brushing against the cool earth. That's when he saw it, a small crystal half buried in the soil. It pulsed faintly, slow and steady, like a heartbeat that belonged to something not quite human. Morty lifted it carefully, and the glow spread across his palm, warm and gentle. It wasn't bright, just alive. For a moment he thought he heard something beneath the pulse, a faint echo of the children's hum, soft as a sigh, carried through memory. "Rick," he called out, his voice quiet in the evening. No answer. He stood there for a while, watching the last bits of daylight sink behind the fence. Crickets began their slow rhythmic song, a kind of earthly echo of the cosmic lullaby that had once filled this place. Morty smiled faintly. "Guess you left me something, huh?" He whispered to the ground. Rick was in the garage, pretending to fix the portal gun. He had been pretending for hours. The bench was cluttered with tools he didn't need, and notes that didn't make sense. The kind of work you do when you're trying to outrun silence. Morty stepped in quietly, the crystal cupped in his hand. "Hey, found something outside," he said. Rick didn't look up. "Unless it's a missing screw from a multidimensional flux capacitor, I'm not interested." Morty rolled his eyes. "You're interested." That earned a glance. Rick's eyes flicked toward the crystal. He froze. The wrench in his hand loosened, clattering softly onto the bench. He stood up, walking closer. The light from the crystal reflected in his pupils, turning them almost glassy. "Where'd you find that?" "In the grass," Morty said. "Right where they used to hum." Rick reached out, hesitated, then took it. The glow brightened faintly at his touch. He held it between his fingers, turning it over like a scientist. But his expression wasn't scientific. It was something quieter, reverent. "Bioluminal residue," he murmured, stabilized into crystalline form. "They must have left it intentionally." Morty tilted his head. "Like a gift?" Rick looked at him, a flicker of something in his eyes, and part wonder, part sadness. "Yeah, like a gift." They stood there for a long time, both staring at the little crystal, as if afraid to breathe too loud and break its spell. "Does it do anything?" Morty asked. Rick shrugged. Maybe it just is." Morty laughed softly. "You saying something doesn't need to have a function." "That's a new one." Rick gave a dry smirk. "Don't push your luck, kid." But even as he joked, he placed the crystal on the workbench carefully, as though setting down a newborn bird. Then he sat, elbows on his knees, staring at it in silence. After a while he spoke again, voice quieter now. "You ever think maybe the universe leaves things behind on purpose? little traces. Just to remind us it's still thinking about us. She'd been restless for weeks. School stress, online noise, the strange static of teenage life. But one night, unable to sleep, she wandered into the backyard. The tree's glow met her halfway, tender and warm. She sat beneath it, cross-legged, and opened her sketchbook. The hum wrapped around her like a slow tide, and for the first time in a long time, the lines she drew flowed without effort. When morning came, she told no one. But she slept better that night, and every night after. Beth discovered the tree by accident. One afternoon, while trimming the hedges, she stopped mid-cut. The air near the tree felt different, softer, charged in a way that made her heartbeat slow down. She walked closer, noticing how its glow seemed to mirror her breath. Without meaning to, she leaned her back against it. The wood was cool and smooth, almost alive beneath her palms. She closed her eyes. For a moment, she wasn't a mother or a surgeon or a daughter, haunted by unspoken questions. She was simply there. When she finally stepped away, she whispered, "Thank you," without knowing why. Jerry, of course, was oblivious. To him, it was just another weird thing Rick had brought into their lives. But even he couldn't deny that the backyard felt nicer. The air was fresher. The house seemed quieter. And whenever he told one of his silly dad jokes near the tree, its leaves shimmered faintly, like laughter carried on wind. He told Beth about it one evening over dinner. "I think it likes me," he said, grinning proudly. Beth smiled. "Then it must have infinite patience." They both laughed. And though Rick groaned audibly from the other room, the hum outside grew just a little louder. Morty began spending more time beneath the tree after that. Sometimes he'd do homework there. Other times just sit in silence. It didn't matter what mood he brought. Anxiety, confusion, nostalgia. The tree seemed to accept it all, glowing in quiet rhythm beside him. One night, as he sat there under the soft branches, he whispered, "Do you miss them too?" The leaves swayed gently. The hum deepened, a tone almost like a sigh. Morty smiled. "Yeah, me too." He thought about the way the alien children had looked at Rick, not with fear or admiration, but understanding. He thought about how Rick had softened, even if he'd never admit it. The glow on his face now, coming from the branches above, looked a lot like that same softness, a reflection of something the universe was still teaching him. Rick, meanwhile, had started documenting the tree's properties. But his notes were different now. Instead of equations and hypotheses, the pages were filled with phrases like "resonates with stillness" and "hums louder near laughter." In the margins, Morty even found one note that said simply, "They left peace behind." He never mentioned it to Rick, of course. Some things you just let be. By autumn, the tree had reached its full height, just tall enough for its glowing leaves to brush against the roof of the garage. At night, its light spilled gently through the windows, painting the lab in pale blues and violets. Rick never closed the blinds. Some nights, Morty would catch him sitting inside, staring out toward it. His face unreadable, his flask untouched, just quiet. One night, Morty joined him. They sat in silence, both watching the branches sway. "You ever think it's like watching us too?" Morty asked softly. Rick smirked. "Kid, everything's watching everything." "That's the point," Morty chuckled, but he didn't press. After a while, Rick's voice dropped lower, almost like a confession. "It's weird," he said. "Usually when something I make grows, it explodes or kills something. This one's different," Morty smiled. "Maybe it's not what you made. Maybe it's what they made through you." Rick was quiet for a long time. Then softly, "Maybe." That night, the wind carried the faint hum of the tree through the open window. It sounded like the children's song, distant, forgiving, endless. Rick lay in bed, half smiling in the dark. "Good job." "Kids," he murmured. The hum answered in kind, just a little louder. Just enough to say it had heard. And somewhere between that sound and the silence that followed, the whole house seemed to drift a little closer to peace. Night had become gentler at the Smith household. The glow from the backyard tree seeped through the curtains like a promise, coloring the walls in shades of ocean blue and starlit silver. Even the hum, that subtle, eternal vibration, had settled into the rhythm of their nights, like the house itself was breathing slower, deeper. Morty lay awake, half dreaming, half listening. Outside, the wind carried the faintest trace of melody, a lullaby he could almost hum along to, but never quite finish. Each note melted before he reached it, slipping back into the quiet, teasing, endless, familiar. It was the same tune he'd heard once before, on the planet where everything had begun, only now it didn't sound distant. It sounded homegrown. He turned toward the window, the glow tracing gentle lines along his face. Somewhere deep in his chest, a weight lifted, replaced by a strange warmth, not joy, not sadness, but something between the two. Something timeless. Rick wasn't sleeping either. In the garage, surrounded by dusty inventions and unfiled notes, he sat slouched in his chair, eyes half closed, flask untouched. The blue light from outside cut through the blinds, falling across his face like liquid moonlight. He'd been pretending for weeks that he wasn't hearing the hum, too. But the truth was it had followed him everywhere. Into his tinkering, his theories, his dreams. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the children again. Not the way they had looked when he left them, but the way they had looked at him, unafraid, calm, certain. As though they already knew this song would continue without them. He picked up a small recorder from the table and clicked it on. "Observation log, day 58, he said quietly. "The resonance frequency of the seedling tree hasn't diminished. If anything, it's grown in amplitude. It's not just reacting to emotion anymore. It's syncing with it. Creating new patterns, like a conversation." He paused. His thumb hovered over the stop button. Then he added softly, "Or maybe it's just trying to keep us company." The next morning, Morty found him asleep at the desk, the recorder still running. Rick's head rested on an open notebook, filled with sketches of sound waves and fragments of musical notation. Morty smiled faintly, switched off the recorder, and whispered, "Night, Grandpa." But later that night, something woke him. Not noise exactly, but presence. The hum was louder than usual, carrying a harmony he'd never heard before. It wasn't just one tone anymore. It was layered, like voices weaving through one another, overlapping in soft waves. Morty got out of bed, heart thudding, and went to the window. The tree was glowing brighter than ever. Its branches swayed without wind, every leaf pulsing in rhythm, blue, silver, violet. The light reflected in the glass like ripples on water, dancing across his face. He didn't call for Rick this time. He just stepped quietly outside, barefoot on cool grass. The air smelled of rain and starlight. Each step closer deepened the sound, until it wasn't humming anymore. It was singing. Morty stopped beneath the tree. The melody wrapped around him like a blanket, gentle, wordless, endless. He closed his eyes. In the dark behind them, he saw flashes, the alien children laughing, the planet's sky burning gold, Rick standing over the crystal with tears he never admitted to. And through it all, that same tune played on unchanged. He whispered, barely audibly, "You're still here, huh?" The leaves trembled in response. A single petal detached, floating slowly toward him. It landed on his palm, cool and glowing faintly. He could hear it. A heartbeat. Couldn't sleep either. Rick's voice broke through the quiet. Morty turned. Rick stood at the edge of the yard, lab coat half-buttoned, hair wild from another sleepless night. The glow painted him in ghost-light blues, and for once he didn't look like the universe's smartest man. He just looked human. "I didn't want to wake you," Morty said softly. "It started singing again." Rick nodded, walking closer. "Yeah, I heard. Thought maybe you'd snuck a Bluetooth speaker out here." Morty laughed quietly. "You really think I'd ruin the vibe with a speaker?" Rick smirked. "Knowing you, you'd probably play whale noises." They both chuckled. The hum seemed to grow warmer around them. Rick reached out, brushing one of the lower branches. The leaves shimmered like glass in moonlight, the tone deepening for a moment before softening again. Like the tree recognized him. He didn't pull his hand away. "You ever wonder if maybe this isn't alien?" Rick murmured. "Maybe it's memory. Maybe the sound's just everything we've done echoing back." Morty thought for a moment, like the universe remembering us. Rick shrugged, or refusing to forget. They stood in silence for a while. The song shifted, slow and steady, like a lullaby that never ended. "Grandpa," Morty finally said, "Yeah? Do you think it'll stop someday?" Rick shook his head. "Nah, some songs don't stop. They just find new instruments." Morty smiled at that. They sat down beneath the tree, the grass cool beneath them. The branches swayed gently above, scattering flakes of light that floated like tiny stars. For a long time, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The melody filled everything. The space between them, the sky above, the soil below. It wasn't a sad song anymore. It was full, alive, infinite. Morty leaned back against the trunk. "That feels like it's singing for us." Rick glanced upward, eyes soft. "Maybe it's singing through us." The words hung in the air, light as mist before dissolving into the sound. As the night deepened, Morty's eyelids grew heavy. The song lulled him towards sleep, steady as the ocean. He mumbled something, a thank you maybe, before drifting off beneath the glowing branches. Rick stayed awake a little longer. He watched his grandson sleeping peacefully, the light painting gentle halos across his face. For once, the old scientist didn't feel the urge to measure, explain, or control. He just listened. He thought about all the universes he'd broken, all the chances he'd thrown away chasing answers. And yet somehow here he was, listening to a song that needed no explanation. He took a slow breath and whispered, "Guess you kids were right." The end isn't silence after all. The leaves above shimmered once more. Rick leaned back against the trunk, his eyes half closing. For the first time in years, sleep came easily, and as he drifted off, the hum rose gently, no longer a sound from another world, but a part of this one. It wound through the branches, across the roof, through the open window, wrapping the entire house in light. Beth stirred in her sleep and smiled. Summer shifted and mumbled softly. Even Jerry dreamed of laughter that echoed like stars. And somewhere beyond the thin veil of dream and waking, the children's voices continued to sing, endless, soft and free. It was the same song they had always sung, from one world to another, waiting for someone to finally hear it. Now, they had. And the song, the one that never ended, became part of the Smith family's quiet nights forever. The years moved quietly, like ripples expanding across still water. Time had softened the edges of everything, the house, the garden, the memories. Even the hum that once filled every corner of the Smith household had settled into something subtler, like the faint rhythm of a heartbeat hidden beneath the noise of everyday life. Morty had grown. His face carried more lines now, not from sorrow but from all the moments that had mattered. His voice had deepened, but when he laughed, really laughed, it still echoed with the boy he once was. The glowing tree stood tall beside the garage, its branches stretching wider than ever, its light dimmer now but somehow warmer. In summer evenings, when the air hung heavy with cicadas, the leaves glowed faintly like fading embers, quiet reminders of a song that had once healed the world. Tonight, Morty stood beneath that tree again. The air was cool, brushed with the scent of rain. The stars were clearer than he'd seen them in years, sharp and endless. He ran his fingers along the bark, tracing the gentle pulse of light that still moved beneath it. Faint but alive, like the last breath of a lullaby that refused to fade. He whispered softly, "Guess you're still here." The glow answered him, rippling faintly. Inside the house, everything was still. The same creaky floorboard by the kitchen door. The same humming fridge that Rick once complained sounded like an existential crisis in appliance form. But the garage, Rick's old lab, had been silent for a long time. Morty had kept it the way it was. The benches, the scattered notes, even the small coffee stain on the console. Dust gathered, sunlight drifted through cracks, but he could never bring himself to clean it. It wasn't clutter. It was memory. He stepped inside, the air cool and heavy with the scent of metal and time. A faint hum, not from machines but from something else, stirred at the edges of hearing. Morty smiled. "I know you're not really gone," he said softly. "You're too stubborn for that." He picked up the old recorder Rick had once used. It was rusted, dented, but when he pressed the button it still played, a static hiss followed by Rick's voice. "Observation log." "Ah, whatever. It's not an observation. It's just me. If anyone finds this, probably you, Morty. Guess I just wanted to say you were right about the hum. It wasn't science. Not really, it was something else. Something I never had the guts to name." There was a pause. Then Rick's voice softened. "I spent my whole life trying to fix everything that broke, machines, universes, people. But maybe things don't need fixing. Maybe they just need someone to stay long enough to listen." Morty stood frozen, the recorder trembling in his hand. Rick's voice continued, quieter now. "If you're hearing this, kid, don't chase the noise. Just follow the quiet. It's louder than you think." The tape clicked off. Morty sat down at the bench, his chest heavy but calm. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Full of memories, laughter, arguments, all the things that made them who they were. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flask, the same one Rick had carried everywhere. It was all dented and empty. Morty set it gently on the table right beside the recorder. "For you." "Old man," he whispered. Then from somewhere distant and beyond the walls, beyond the night, there came a sound, a hum, soft, slow, steady. Morty stood, heart pounding. He stepped outside into the yard, the wind brushing through his hair, the tree glowing brighter than it had in years. The branches shimmered with light that climbed toward the stars, as if answering a call only it could hear. The hum grew louder, layered, infinite, the same song that had once filled the world with life. But this time there was something different about it. It wasn't just the children's song. It was Rick's voice, faint, woven between the tones like a memory turned to music. Morty looked up, tears blurring the stars. "You hear that?" he said softly. "You really never left." The sky shimmered. He could see it, just for a moment, a faint outline among the constellations, a silhouette leaning back in a recliner, flask in hand, eyes half closed, the faintest smirk on his face. Rick. The hum deepened, glowing through the clouds like the universe itself was exhaling. Morty laughed through his tears. "You old bastard. You actually did it." The air pulsed once more, gentle, rhythmic, and then softened into silence. Days passed. Then weeks. Then seasons. The world carried on, but the song never truly left. It lived in the quiet moments, in the breeze through the window, in the rhythm of rain against the roof, in the warmth that filled the house even when no one spoke. Beth often said the place felt peaceful now, though she couldn't explain why. Summer studied under the glowing tree every evening, saying the light helped her focus. Jerry, oblivious as ever, started telling neighbors it was powered by quantum sunlight and asked if he could patent it. Morty just smiled. He never explained. Some stories weren't meant to be told. They were meant to be felt. One night he sat by the window looking out at the glowing tree. The sky stretched endlessly above, that same open sky where it had all begun. The stars shimmered faintly, and for a second he could have sworn one of them flickered in rhythm with the hum. He whispered, almost laughing, "Guess they really did change everything." And somewhere beyond the veil of time, in a place where science met serenity, Rick sat beneath a different sky, a recliner at his side, a flask in hand, the light of infinite galaxies reflecting in his eyes. He watched over a world he'd once broken, now healed not by intellect but by love. He took a slow sip, smiled and murmured to himself, "Yeah, everything." The light around him shimmered brighter, merging with the stars, until it became indistinguishable, one final note folding back into the song that never ended. And as the universe exhaled its eternal lullaby, the screen of imagination faded to black. The last light, gentle, golden, alive, lingered just a moment longer, then dissolved into the quiet.